The Ghost Who Wasn't There. A Paranormal Cozy Mystery. Eli Carter and the Ghost Hackers. Paranormal Mysteries, Book 2. Written by Angela Pepper. Read for you by John Perhala. Chapter 1. Eli Carter drove home with the van's heaters on high. It was a warm spring afternoon, not heater weather at all, but his clothes were soaked from the so-called decontamination shower. An hour earlier, Eli had accepted a job offer with Ghost Hackers, which was either an extermination business for infestations of a paranormal nature or an appliance repair shop that dabbled in fraud. Although Eli had dealt with a para-electric element named Donnie the day before, and even been briefly possessed by the ghost, Eli wasn't entirely sure he believed in ghosts. The microchip in Eli's brain wouldn't let him tell a lie to another person, but his brain was very good at pulling Eli's leg, so to speak. It kept coming up with alternate explanations for paranormal things he'd experienced. Maybe ghosts weren't real, and he'd been hallucinating for days. Eli nervously tapped on the steering wheel. If he wasn't sure about this new job he'd accepted, how would he ever sell his girlfriend on it? He arrived home at sunset, parked his delivery van in the assigned spot, and stepped out into the chill of the underground parking lot. 6 floors down, the air was so cool that a ghostly fog floated up from his damp body as he walked to the elevator. His wet jeans chafed painfully against his legs, making Eli feel terrible for soldiers. Whenever he had some small discomfort, such as a hangnail or stubbed toe, Eli would think of soldiers in the battlefield and how much worse they had to endure. This didn't make him feel better about getting to live his comfortable life. It only made him feel soft and weak. His posture slumped on the elevator ride up to the 4th-floor apartment he shared with his girlfriend, Brenda. She was the one who'd gotten him his decent-paying job at the delivery company, and she was not going to be happy to learn he was resigning to work for an appliance repair shop that possibly dabbled in fraud. Eli opened the door to the apartment and braced himself for battle. Tiny little red-headed Brenda didn't look that tough, but she knew how to apply pressure. More than once, she'd threatened to use a fork or knife to drill into Eli's head and dig around for his alleged, according to her, microchip. The truth was, Brenda was more bark than bite. She had punched him in the face once, but in a groggy state, half asleep. Eli had technically started it by accidentally dropping his elbow on her nose, and she'd only been reacting in her sleep when she gave him a black eye with her tiny fist. Eli was not a battered boyfriend. Badgered, sure, but not battered. He stepped into the apartment and prepared for a round with his little badger. He found her in the corner they called a kitchen, even though it wasn't much of a kitchen. She had her strawberry blonde-red hair up in a loose bun, and she wore a pink striped apron over a dress. She looked like a spokesmodel for apple pie. Eli's jaw dropped. "Brenda, what's going on?" She put her hand on her hip and gave him a coy look, batting her darkly coated eyelashes. "Dinner's ready." She pulled an aluminum loaf pan from the large toaster oven they used for cooking. Eli swallowed hard and eyed the brown thing in the pan. Surely she was testing him with another lentil loaf. The last one hadn't killed him, but this one would. "Why does it smell so good?" he asked. Her eyes narrowed in warning. "I'm trying to be nice, so don't ruin it." He excused himself to get changed out of his damp clothes. His plans for breaking the job news to her needed more refinement and maybe alcohol. In the bedroom, he chose a pair of sweatpants, all the better to accommodate the swelling of his digestive system as it tried to assimilate the horrors of a loaf made of lentils. Something was weird, though. His mouth was watering. He inhaled deeply and walked back out to take his seat at the table where they ate. This loaf didn't smell at all like Brenda's cooking. It smelled like food. "How was your day?" he asked, tentatively. She sat down across from him and said, very plainly, "I missed you last night. Did you miss me?" Eli had spent the previous night on someone's sofa after facilitating a reunion between a father and his deceased son. He'd been in contact with Brenda by phone throughout the weekend, but he hadn't thought about whether or not he'd missed her. "I didn't not miss you," he answered. "Oh, Eli," she rolled her eyes, "I missed you so much. I made you a real meatloaf with dead cow in it." "I thought I smelled dead cow. It smells really good," she whispered. "There's chutney, but it's on the side. It's optional." "Optional," he repeated, his voice thick and deep in his chest, like a growl. "I really missed you," she said. Eli smiled at this. 2 nights away from each other, and she was sweeter than shortcake. He leaned to the side and looked at her bare legs sticking out from under the flower-covered dress. He did love those pale legs of hers and the rest of her. Brenda was a ferocious little badger, but she was his ferocious little badger. "Did you really see a ghost?" she asked. "I didn't see him so much as I felt him." He pulled his gaze away from Brenda's wonderful legs and turned to the equally wonderful loaf of dead cow. "It could have been the power of suggestion," he explained. "But whatever happened, it felt real. I swear I was reading text messages off the panel of the old man's microwave, and then the words were just in my head, coming out of my mouth. Donnie wanted his father to stop waiting for him to come back to the farmhouse. Or maybe that was what I imagined. I could have looked around the room, felt the name carved into the desk, and figured out the rest." Brenda added some salad to Eli's plate. He shoveled down the meatloaf rapidly. Usually he would eat the salad first and save the best for last, but there was no holding back tonight. The dead cow meatloaf was so good. He looked up at Brenda, at her familiar pale blue eyes. She really did have pretty eyes, especially right now, because the light was different. Eli blinked and looked around the apartment. All the lights were out, and they were eating by the glow of a dozen candles he hadn't noticed when he'd walked in. "Candles," he said. Brenda smirked. "Honestly, Eli, I could dye my hair blue and trade all the furniture with the neighbors, and you wouldn't notice for days." He turned in his chair and eyed the living room furniture with suspicion. "Where did that chair come from?" he demanded. "Well, that's your chair. I just tidied up and put new covers on the throw pillows." "Oh." He returned to his meatloaf for 2 bites, then whipped his head around to give the chair another suspicious look. The chair looked weird, but he couldn't think of what it was supposed to look like. Brenda snapped her fingers to get his attention. "Hey, you left out all the good parts of your story. What happened to Donnie, the old guy's son? How did he die?" "I don't know." Eli's voice caught in his throat, the way it did when he tried to say something that wasn't true. A warm sensation tickled over his skin, followed by a chill that made him shudder at the rapid temperature shift. The ghost of Donnie had been inside his body for only a few minutes, but something remained. A residue. Eli hadn't noticed the residue until that very moment. Now there were things in his head that didn't belong to him. He did know how Donnie died. He felt it happen felt the bullets burn through his knees, his guts, and then his lungs. Eli pulled back from the pain and pulled back through time to the day before Donnie got shot. The feeling that was both hot and cold kept pulsing through Eli, and the only thing that calmed it down was talking. He began to tell Brenda about Donnie, and the words flowed from him easily. The simpler he told the story, the more real it became. Donnie and a pretty girl had shared a room in a decrepit boarding house. He loved the girl. She loved him. But she loved drugs more. She always promised she'd go to rehab, if only they had the money. One day, Donnie decided to show her how much he loved her. He told her to wait in the room for him, and he would return with all the money they needed to make their dreams come true. She kissed him goodbye, a sad look in her eyes. He prowled the neighborhood and found a gas station to rob. He borrowed a gun from another guy at the boarding house in exchange for a share of robbery proceeds. He took the gun and did what he felt he needed to do. With cash stuffed in his pockets, Donnie returned to the room at the boarding house. He arrived 14 minutes before the police, but he didn't know that. He didn't know he was about to die. His hands were shaking as he got out the key for the room. He was happy. Nobody had gotten hurt at the gas station. He had the money. Life was good. They were going to get cleaned up and rehab. Then he would take her to see the farm where he grew up. They'd stay there with his dad until they were ready to start their life over. With a shaking hand, he opened the door, stepped 1 foot inside the dim room, and saw the love of his life slumped over limply, the needle at her side. Her eyes were open, but the wrong kind of open. He screamed down the hallway for someone to get help. Maybe he screamed words, or maybe he just screamed. He left the door ajar and ran to her side. His training kicked in, and he tried to bring his pretty girlfriend back to life. He'd taken lifeguard training years earlier. Now he let his tears blur his eyes so he could pretend it was the practice dummy he was working on. She was cold, her face drained of color, but he kept working. He would keep doing compressions until he collapsed, or so he told himself. When someone banged at the doorway to the room, he yelled for them to come in. The men who came in were police, not the medical assistants he'd been hoping for. They were on high alert, weapons drawn. Donnie remembered the gun he still had tucked into the back of his jeans. He reached for the gun. They told him to freeze. He knew what would happen next. He knew. His beautiful love was already gone, and his lips were cold from hers. He knew what would happen, so he stood and faced the police. He reached for the gun, which wasn't even loaded, and turned it on them. The bullets stung and burned, but not for long. And then Donnie was a ghost. Time passed. He couldn't find her. He looked everywhere. He lost her name. He lost her face. But he still felt her like a hole in his soul. Sometimes he forgot what or who he was looking for, but he kept looking. More time passed. Donnie forgot he was a ghost. He tried to flag down taxis, tried to eat at restaurants. Everyone was so rude. He held on to hope that when he found the pretty girl he was looking for, she would understand. More time passed, and he finally got a call from her. She told him she'd followed his directions, and she was at the farm, where he'd grown up. His father needed him, she said. The old man was just as stubborn as Donnie, and he wouldn't listen to her. He pretended he couldn't see her, couldn't hear her. Donnie went to the farmhouse, where he was reunited with his love. She'd forgotten her own name, and they laughed and held each other and didn't care about things like names. She teased him about the posters on the walls of his childhood room and laughed over how he'd carved his name into his desk a dozen times. He said the desk needed one more carving. He worked for months, etching the name he now called her, Pretty, next to his on the desk. He joined the two names by surrounding them with a heart. The carving took ages because he had to concentrate so hard to move a physical object. Some days he felt like he was going mad, especially when he forgot who he was. His father still wouldn't budge from the farmhouse. It was Donnie's girlfriend who'd figured out how to send messages through the appliances. They worked together, trying to get the attention of the housekeeper, but she was too scared to listen. They'd nearly given up on helping the old man when Khan and Eli showed up. Then Eli knew the rest, and now he knew it from all angles. He felt Donnie's frustration, anger, and longing. He felt his joy at being able to communicate with his father after so many years, and how it felt to say goodbye. Eli felt what it meant to be dead, and from that, what it meant to be alive. Chapter 2. Someone sniffed. Brenda was crying. The fog in Eli's head lifted, and he saw her, mascara-darkened tears spilling down her pale cheeks. "That's so beautiful," she said. He picked up a napkin and reached across the table to catch her tears. Tonight was not going at all how he'd expected. "Brenda, he never told me those things. It's all in my head now." He rubbed his temples. "This is so crazy." "I think it's amazing. You just told me all that stuff, and I didn't have to drag it out of you one piece at a time. You're finally coming out of your shell." He gave her a suspicious look. First the meatloaf, now the flattery. What was Brenda hiding? Had she thrown out a stack of his comic books to make room for more plastic boxes? His pulse rate sped up. Had she discovered the ring he'd kept hidden in the secret compartment behind the bathroom mirror? A drop of sweat ran down the edge of his forehead. "This ghost experience you had is a good thing," she concluded. "I just wish it hadn't been so sad with Donnie's girlfriend leaving him like that." "She didn't leave. She died of a drug overdose. It was ironic, I think, because it was the day before she was going to get clean." Brenda blinked and gave Eli a look, the schoolteacher look she got sometimes when she knew something and was hoping to beam it into Eli's head so he could think it was his own idea. "Think about it," she said. "The whole thing is sad. I don't want to think about it anymore." He rubbed his scalp vigorously, as though a massage might help push away these new memories. Brenda rose from her chair and came over to sit on Eli's lap. She pulled his hands from his head and then smoothed down his hair. Her cool fingers felt good against his skin. "Donnie's girlfriend didn't want to go to rehab," Brenda explained. "It wasn't an accident." A wave of sorrow rose inside Eli. She was right. Donnie had known it as well, and the truth ran beneath the memories. The truth hit Eli hard. Not every tragedy is decided by fate. Sometimes humans are their own creators and destroyers. The sorrow filled Eli and spilled over. He nodded forward and rested his cheek against Brenda's shoulder. She wrapped her arms around his neck and rocked him. The world washed over both of them. He took her hand and kissed the jagged scars on her wrist. She kissed the top of his head. "I'm sorry," she said. Eli knew she wasn't apologizing for kicking him in the kidneys the other day, or for any of the mean things she'd said to him during the week. She continued in a whisper, "I wish I didn't understand these things." "Don't be sorry," he said. "We're not like them, not like Donnie and his girlfriend. Our story isn't a tragedy." "Not yet," She sniffed. Not ever, because I'm your big, strong Eli, and you can't get enough of me. Her sniff turned into a giggle. She massaged his upper arms. You do feel stronger today. Did you work out? He flexed his biceps. You like that? He hadn't worked out, except for 2 nights of fighting for his life against the alleged cat wraith. Such big muscles, she cooed. Eli flexed again. He did feel stronger. Brenda dried her tears and leaned in to lick the side of his neck, from his shirt collar to his earlobe. I missed you, she whispered. He looked into her cool blue eyes. Did that demon thing come around on Saturday night? The cat wraith? No. She looked alarmed. Is it real? I don't know, he said, because he really didn't. Maybe we should set up a camera in the bedroom to see if we can catch any action on video. She gave him a playful look. You naughty boy. Not like that, he chuckled. I meant... He was cut off by Brenda's lips against his. They kissed, and he ran his hands down and then up her bare legs. He stood from the chair, and she squealed and clung to him, wrapping her legs around his waist. The talk of the other people's tragedies infused their kissing with loss and urgency. Eli carried Brenda down the hallway to the bedroom, where they lit a fire bright enough to keep away the darkness for one more night. Chapter 3. The cat wraith returned before dawn. It had been chasing rats in the nearby alleys for hours and was played out, ready to come home. Eli and Brenda both looked so appealing in their blissful slumber, like 2 soft dumplings on top of a delicious stew. The cat wraith sniffed them as it circled the bed, feet tick-ticking on the floor. The taste of rat was still in its mouth, along with bone fragments. After a moment, it slithered under the bed, where it found something fragrant between the plastic bins. Eli's socks. The cat wraith breathed deeply, taking in the delicious perfume and purring. Suddenly, something wasn't right. One of the rats must have been poisoned. It wasn't digesting, and nausea came, along with bad memories. The cold cage, the box, darkness, but not the good kind. The wraith shifted through smoke and into the form of a house cat. It coughed, then went hark, hark, and vomited. The partially digested rat remains landed on top of Eli's wonderful sock. Now the sock was icky. Yuck. The cat squeezed back out between the plastic bins and padded over to the side of the bed. It jumped up on Brenda's side. As it looked upon her face through feline eyes, it remembered loved ones. Once upon a time, it had been a he, and he had been loved. He had been loved by a human girl and kissed on the shiny black nose, and he had been the luckiest kitty. That was either before or after he had been a god in Egypt. He couldn't remember the timeline, but being a kitty and being a god had both been good. He rubbed the top of his silky black forehead against Brenda's chin, and then told her his name, from when he'd been worshipped by Egyptians. She scarcely stirred in her sleep, but she heard him. The cat walked over her chest to Eli and gave him a sniff. This human's head didn't smell nearly as good as his socks. The visible pulse in the human's neck gave him pause. He considered his options for play. Strangulation? Nah. Eli was a fun toy, but the cat wraith was played out. He curled up at the foot of the bed where he slept soundly. In the morning, when the curtains opened on their timer, he had a delicious stretch with pointed toes, then turned into smoke and dissipated. Eli turned off the clock's alarm and rubbed his eyes. The room was bright, and the curtains were already open. Either Brenda had adjusted the timer on the curtains so they opened before the alarm sounded as intended, or the alarm clock was losing time at a greater rate than the curtain timer. Eli assumed the former and didn't even consider the latter because he knew nothing about para-electrical elements and how they affected their electronics-based surroundings. Few people did. "The cat was here," Brenda murmured sleepily. Eli checked his throat for bruising or tenderness. He detected no signs of recent strangling. "Are you sure?" He sat up and looked down at Brenda with concern. "Did it hurt you? I'll tell Con about it and ask him to do something." She smiled. "His name is Monty, and I think we should keep him." Eli spotted something at the foot of the bed. He leaned forward and stared in disbelief at the fine black hairs visible on the white duvet cover. "We shouldn't have left that window open in the living room," he said. "The cat must have come up the fire escape." He picked up one of the hairs and examined it. He'd never had a cat, but he was fairly certain the hair between his fingers was that of a cat. He glanced around the room for something to put the hair in, like an envelope. When he turned back to the hair, it was gone from his fingers. There was nothing on the duvet cover either. Eli cursed softly under his breath and started searching the covers for more fur. "Are you feeling okay?" Brenda asked. "Did you really see a cat? Or are you pulling my leg? And why would you say his name is Monty? Was he wearing a collar with a tag?" Brenda stretched and combed her fingers through her tangled pale red hair. "No collar. He just told me. I can't explain. It was like a dream, but not a dream. He curled up at the foot of the bed and had a nap because he was tired from chasing rats." She rubbed the top of her eyelids, careful not to disturb the thick coating of mascara she wore on her eyelashes at all times, even to sleep. "I think he threw up under the bed." Eli climbed out of the bed and took 2 steps back, away from Brenda. "A demon ghost threw up underneath our bed? You're talking crazy." She shrugged. "You're the one who got possessed. I don't know why you can't believe this." He looked at the spot on the bed where he'd seen the fur. It was on Brenda's side, below her feet. Something clicked in his head. He decided something. "Fine. Cat wraiths are real." And from that moment on, he wouldn't try to explain away the existence of Monty. The cat wraith was no longer an alleged cat wraith, and it was not a hallucination from mysterious business card powder or all-natural sleeping pills. Along with becoming a believer in cat wraiths, Eli received an unexpected bonus gift: jealousy. "He talked to you?" Eli asked. "Yes. He told me his name, and then he curled up with his nose in his tail, right at my feet. So cute, so cute." "That traitor. He was my ghost. Mine, not yours, Brenda. Mine." Brenda's thin red eyebrows pushed together. "You're doing it again," she said. His face twitched. He wanted to stomp his foot. He really did. But he was 30, or thereabouts. Throwing a tantrum was not appropriate, and he knew it, but he still had all the emotions. "Take a deep breath," she said. He was in an emotional freefall. Why couldn't he have anything to himself? "Monty's your cat, too," Brenda said, soothingly. Eli grumbled and then shook out his hands, which had been clenched. "Fine, we'll share him," he said. "But if he starts acting up, we're getting an exorcism." Brenda got up and began smoothing out the bed covers. Chuckling, she said, "This is our life now. We're just an ordinary couple with a ghost cat." Eli winced. There was something he'd been meaning to tell her the night before, but hadn't. Brenda would probably murder him on the spot when he told her about his new career. "About that whole ordinary couple thing," he said. "Yes?" She looked hopeful. Eli winced again and looked around the room for blunt objects that might be embedded in his skull in the next minute or so. He didn't like the look of the glass candle holders on the dresser near Brenda. They could do some damage. Just to be safe, he walked back over to the bed, picked up a pillow, and handed it to her. "What are you doing?" She was smiling, baring her pointy teeth. Eli's stomach made the sound it usually did when it was trying to digest one of her jam-covered lentil loaves. He closed his eyes and blurted out, "I actually accepted a job working for that guy Khan. I'm supposed to start today." She didn't say anything. Eyes closed, he braced himself for a bashing by pillow. Nothing happened. "But you have to work today, on your route." Brenda's voice was calm and careful. He slowly opened his eyes. "You can reschedule everyone, can't you? I've seen you do it in 5 seconds flat. Please, Brenda, I really want this. I'll do anything else you want. We can go to that new store that's just closet organizers and containers. We can pack a lunch and shop the whole day." She tipped her head to the side and looked at him with an expression he'd never seen before. Eli's imagination worked at double time. This was the calm before the storm. She was powering up, plotting something. His eyes flicked between Brenda and the glass candle holders. "I should have told you sooner," he said, "but you've been encouraging me to think creatively about my career. This ghost thing is almost certainly a terrible idea, but it sure is interesting, don't you think?" Brenda swished her pursed lips from side to side, and then said, "When I said think creatively, I meant applying for a management position." He fidgeted wildly at the suggestion of a desk job, his hands fluttering at his sides like spooked chickens. Desk job? Being cooped up inside an office all day? No way. Not even for 3 times the pay. He had to be out and about, going from place to place and solving puzzles, even if they were easy puzzles, like packing different-sized parcels into the back of the van efficiently. Carefully, he said, "We both know I'm not management material." She set the pillow down on the bed, then slowly walked around the bed toward him. She brought up her small hands, her arms stretched out toward his throat. So it was just a little strangulation. Eli could handle that. He closed his eyes and braced himself for throttling. What happened next confused him. Brenda wrapped her arms around his neck tenderly. She clung to him, her face against his neck. "I'm so proud of you," she said. His eyes flew open. "What?" She squeezed him tighter. "You're my big, strong ghost hunter." "Ghost hacker." "What's the difference?" "Mostly trademark or licensing. I'm not sure." "My big, strong ghost hacker." She kept hugging him, which he liked. When she finally pulled away, they sat on the bed to work out the logistical details. Brenda got her tablet and was able to change some routes around. "You can always come back," she said. "I don't want to bring people their boxes anymore." "You're so stubborn." "I want to do something cool with my life." "Are you sure it's this?" Eli paused. "I don't know. What's the worst that could happen?" "You could get possessed by ghosts and go insane," she smirked. "More insane." "Brenda, I'm not crazy." "Right. You just have a microchip implanted in your brain." She rolled her eyes. "Well, that's quirky, not crazy." She patted him on the back. "You certainly are an original, Eli Carter." He chuckled. "They made me, then threw away the mold." Brenda looked down at the shapes on her tablet screen and flicked some schedules around. "I'm happy for you," she said quietly. "And I'm proud of you. I hope you have fun today." Eli didn't know how to respond to Brenda's surprisingly positive reaction. He'd always suspected she had a special sense for detecting when he was having fun, so she could squash that fun. He got an ominous feeling. If you were wrong about people in the past, you were going to be wrong in the future. Brenda announced the time and said, "You better hit the shower. Actually, no, just get dressed. You don't have time for a shower." "I'll hurry," he said. 1 minute shower." "But you're incapable." "Set a timer." He backed out of the bedroom, his eyes on the clock. If he had a 60-second shower and then hit mostly green lights, he could drop off Brenda on time. He jumped into the shower, intending to keep it really short, a 30-second shower to stay on the safe side. But the water was hot and really enjoyable, so he extended it to the full minute. Oh, but he had to shampoo his hair, so he needed to add on a minute for that. You can't show up for your new job with oily hair. Had it even been a full minute already? He tried counting the seconds in his head, but kept getting distracted and having to start over. 9.5 minutes passed, but Eli convinced himself he'd been counting fast, and it was more like 5, which wasn't unreasonable for a shower. He would just have to drive really fast. The hot water felt so good. 1 more minute. Finally, after 13 minutes and 4 seconds, he turned off the water and rushed around in a mad panic, getting ready. He'd meant to wear something smart yet casual for his first day at Ghost Hackers, but force of habit made him reach for his delivery uniform. He put on the polyester shorts and dorky shirt without noticing. Chapter 4. Eli parked his van in front of Ghost Hackers, then sprinted up to the door. The shop was dark, but the door was unlocked. The phone on the desk at the back was ringing. Eli's new boss, Con Hart, strolled toward the phone. Con was about 30, muscular and cool as hell, with dark eyebrows and bleached white hair. Despite this, he answered the phone with a polite, meek voice. "Thank you for calling the original Ghost Hackers, where customer service is our passion. How may I help you?" Eli chuckled to himself and listened as his new boss asked the potential customer a number of questions, punctuated by nerdy chuckles. Con paced as he talked, a long, coiled phone cord acting as his tether to the call. He picked up a stapler and shot staples into a garbage bin. Eli stood on the customer side of the counter, unsure about crossing over. "I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news," Con said into the phone apologetically, "but what you're describing sounds serious. 2 of them? Gosh, 2 poltergeists. Would you be satisfied if we scared off the biggest one?" Con turned to wave at Eli. He held the phone to his ear with one shoulder while he beckoned for Eli to push through the gate at the front counter and come back. Eli stepped through, glancing around for signs of Con's sister, Valentine. The shop was narrow and deep, somewhat open at the front, then progressively more labyrinthine as he went deeper. He heard the sounds of movement and caught a glimpse of someone with a brown ponytail clanging around in what appeared to be a workshop. Con kept talking on the phone, so Eli walked over to the doorway to the workshop. Unlike the front of the shop, which held shelves of old household appliances ready for sale, this room held the same things, but in a dismantled state. Valentine huddled over a workbench, examining a circuit board through a magnification lens. Her brown ponytail swung with the slight movements of her head. Eli took 2 tentative steps into the workshop, cleared his throat, and asked, "Is that?" He didn't get to finish asking his question, because Valentine startled at his voice, the sudden movement of her arm knocking a mug to the concrete floor. Eli apologized and ran into the room to help clean up the spill on the floor. He didn't have any towels, though, nor were there any in sight. What he did do was make the spill worse by trampling through it. "Oops," he said, stepping through the spill a 3rd time. Valentine didn't seem upset about the broken mug. She stared at him with an amused expression. "You must have quiet energy," she said. Not many people can sneak up on me like that." Eli pointed to his feet. "These shoes are very quiet. People don't find me quiet, though. I drum a lot." He demonstrated by tapping on the counter with 2 fingers. "Like this." He kept drumming until the social awkwardness reached a crescendo, and he stopped. He put his hands in his pockets. Valentine sat on a tall stool, the rotating kind, and she spun around to get something from the table behind her. She grabbed a tool the size and shape of a potato peeler. She swiveled back and waved the tool up and down between them, as though scanning Eli. "What's that?" Eli asked. "Con used something like that back at the farmhouse." "Ooh, blinky lights. What does that mean? Can I touch it?" Valentine studied the tool in her hand as it pulsed with multicolored flashes of light. "Interesting," she said. "What did it do? What's so interesting? Can I try?" She set the tool back on the work surface without any explanation. Eli really wanted to play with the scanner. His fingers started drumming inside his pockets. He walked through the spilled drink a few more times. Valentine went back to her work, ignoring him. He listened to Con on the other side of the doorway, finishing his scam. Con said meekly, "Listen, my boss is away today, so I'm going to do you a favor. I know a guy. He's the real deal, a necromancer/exorcist. I'll give you his number, but I've got to warn you. Only call if you're desperate, and it's your last resort, because he won't be cheap, and he only takes cash. That's not a problem, is it?" Eli listened to Con pacing while he waited for the potential client's response. "I could never do that," Valentine commented to Eli. "Me neither. Your brother's a real pro." "He's a pro, all right." She pulled on a pair of safety glasses and reached for a tool that resembled a woman's curling iron. Eli remembered the tool from high school. It was a soldering iron for melting beads of metal on circuit boards. Now she was looking around for something. She glanced over Eli, then at the shelves beside him, then the pile of circuit boards and housings across the workbench, then over to a pile of parts on the other side of her. Eli smiled. She had the soldering iron in hand, so of course she was looking for the soldering wire. A spool of it was right in front of her, practically touching her left hand. He stepped forward, crunching through the spilled tea and broken mug yet again, then reached out and tapped on the spool of soldering wire. "Your wire is right here," he said. Instead of picking up the spool to do her work, Valentine set down the iron and pulled off the safety glasses. "I knew it," she said. "You have very high intuition readings." "That was a test," he said, proud of himself for catching on. Valentine's pretty lips curled up in a crooked smile. The warmth went all the way up to her eyes, which were a softer, lovelier version of Con's green eyes. "What does it all mean?" he asked. "You see things other people don't." Eli snorted in disagreement. He'd spent 20 minutes the night before examining the brown recliner in the living room, trying to figure out if it was the same one that had been there since he'd moved in with Brenda, or if she was playing a trick on him. "Your scanner must be broken," he said. "I'm clueless about noticing things. It drives my girlfriend crazy because I can't tell if she's wearing a new dress or got her hair cut." "But that stuff doesn't matter." Eli laughed. "Oh, could you write that out on an official girl note for me?" Valentine smiled. "An official girl note? You are so kooky." Eli bobbed his head happily. He was feeling very pleased with himself. First, he passed the test by being intuitive and helpful, and now he'd made a stellar joke about girls writing notes to each other to excuse typical guy behavior on a case-by-case basis. Plus, he'd mentioned his girlfriend, so now he wouldn't have to feel so guilty about looking at Valentine with her pink shirt and red zip-up hoodie over her nice curves. Eli stopped laughing abruptly and turned his head away, Looking at Valentine's nice curves was not okay. He quickly exited the room, muttering about getting some paper towels for the spilled tea. Con was still on the phone, pacing and pinching the spot between his dark eyebrows. As he listened to the caller, he jutted out his square jaw and tipped his head from side to side, stretching his muscular neck. Eli surreptitiously glanced down at his own biceps while flexing. He would have to hit the gym so he wouldn't look too scrawny next to Con. He would start on that magical day everything begins tomorrow. Con's polite voice was starting to crack at the edges with annoyance. "Sir, did you find that pen and paper yet?" He glanced over to Eli and pretended to shoot himself. Eli chuckled softly and took a seat in the middle step of a wooden stepladder. He had been on his way to the store's kitchenette to get paper towels, but that task was long forgotten. Now he watched Con shoot staples into the garbage. Con had good aim. Eli's thoughts wandered to a daydream about taking up target practice. Eli's mind could wander surprisingly far, considering it was attached to his spinal column. The thing about Eli's mind was it could do amazing things, just not for very long. He had the capacity to be profoundly gifted in a number of subjects, but his teachers all agreed he didn't apply himself. Apply himself. What did that even mean, anyway? Apply was something you did with paint or sunscreen or other liquids. Whenever Eli read that phrase, "Eli does not apply himself," on his evaluation slips, he always imagined himself piercing the skin of his fingertips and bleeding all over his homework until it was covered in applied Eli. That was pretty much how homework felt to him anyway. Con hung up the heavy vintage phone with a clatter. "You'd think it would get easier with practice," Con said. "I thought you did a great job," Eli replied. "For a moment I was a little scared about coming into contact with this exorcist guy until I remembered it was you." Con gave him a sideways look, one eyebrow raised. No wonder Con was so cool. He could move his eyebrows independently. That made anyone 10% cooler. "And I don't scare you?" The pitch of his voice had completely changed from the nerdy-sounding tone he'd used on the incoming phone call on his landline. "I'm a practitioner of the dark arts." His voice was low and menacing, and his dark green eyes seemed to flicker with an internal fire. Eli swallowed hard. "You scare me sometimes." "Good," Con growled, "because I am one bad-to-the-bone necromancer." He grabbed a bright yellow mug from the desk and nodded for Eli to follow him. "Let's make some happy tummy tea and plan today's attack." Eli jumped to his feet, making the ladder rattle. "Yes, sir." The kitchenette lay beyond the enclosed workshop area where Valentine was still working. Beyond that, another door led to the washroom where Eli had been initiated the day before with an ice-cold shower. Con pulled a box of tea bags from the cupboard. To Eli's surprise, it really was happy tummy tea, and he hadn't misheard a moment earlier. The tea appeared to be a chamomile and mint blend, along with some other herbs that aided digestion. Con didn't ask if Eli wanted any. He just rinsed out another mug and filled the kettle with water for two. Eli's gaze came to rest on the roll of paper towels. He thought of Valentine's attractively tapered waist, and he got the sense he was forgetting something. Eli experienced that feeling a lot, and whenever he did, he pulled his phone from his pocket to check the next scheduled location on his route. He stared down at his phone, confused by the lack of instructions. He stared at the phone for all of 12 seconds before he remembered he wasn't a delivery driver anymore, as of today. The phone began to ring in his hand. "Gah!" said Eli. His phone was usually set to vibrate, but it was definitely ringing. "That's the client," Con said calmly. "How did I get your phone?" "That's your phone." Con poured hot water into the two mugs. "I gave him your number instead of mine." "This is the client," Eli said. The call was from a blocked number. The phone suddenly felt very hot and heavy in his hand. because responsibility was heavy. Everything in the world that wasn't the phone became distant and out of focus. Eli tried to hand the phone to Con, but he wouldn't take it. "I shouldn't answer this," Eli said, his voice small and swallowed within his throat, barely making noise. "Hurry up, or it'll go to voicemail." "I'm sorry, but I can't do what you do." He hung his head dejectedly. "You shouldn't have hired me. I'm the wrong guy. It's complicated, but I simply cannot do what you do. I can't." "Don't make me fire you, Eli Carter. Do what you have to do." Chapter 5. The phone kept ringing. Con blew over his steaming mug and looked at Eli with a calm, steady expression. "You might get fired, but not like this," Con said. "Answer the call. I already got most of the details. This one's a slam dunk. Or if you prefer baseball metaphors over basketball, it's a home run." Eli stared at his very heavy, ringing phone. 2 beads of sweat ran down his body. One ran along the side of his forehead, and the other ran down his lower back and into his crack. He frowned at the phone. Crack sweat was an omen for him, as it should be for all guys. Rarely does something good happen when your crack is full of sweat. Eli touched the screen. It flashed green, connecting. He raised the phone to his ear and tried to answer with the same gruff hello Con would use for the second half of the con. Eli's gruff voice came out sounding like somebody's grandmother calling the local radio station to complain about the cats who'd been using her potato patch as a litter box. "Hello?" Eli said. A cantankerous male voice replied. "Are you his secretary?" "I'm new here," Eli said, still in falsetto. "I need one of them spirit things, an exorcism." The man's voice crackled, and he had the bluntness of someone past retirement age, past giving a crap about politeness. "Okay." "Well," said the old man impatiently, "can you send him over right now? I got 2 poltergeists and they're driving me crazy. I can't work. I can't sleep. I can barely think with all the damn noise." Eli tried to picture the man on the other end of the line. He got an image of a man with greasy gray hair and a beer belly that stained the buttons of his shirt, the look of a day drinker. In fact, the guy didn't sound that sober at the moment. Eli remembered some things he'd read in psychology textbooks before he'd given up on that career path. Excess drinking could cause psychosis, and this man could be imagining his 2 poltergeists. Eli looked up at Con for guidance. He covered the mouthpiece with his hand and whispered, "Day drinker. Might be hallucinating." "As long as he pays," Con replied, just like Eli knew he would. "Hello?" The voice on the line got louder. "You still there, or do you have to call someone else?" Eli replied, "I'll take your address and pass it along, but I can't make any guarantees." Con said softly, "Tell him it's cash only." "Sir, it's cash only. He told me to say that to you." Con's eyes flashed a warning. Eli winced. His crack was now a flood zone. Of course, he knew he wasn't supposed to reveal that last part, but the microchip that wouldn't let him lie also made it difficult to stay quiet about things. Not impossible, but difficult. "How much are you taking me for?" demanded the old man. Eli relayed the question, and Con quoted a dollar amount equivalent to an entire month of Eli and Brenda's rent. Eli passed the number along, and the client begrudgingly agreed to it, then gave the address. "The house is orange. You can't miss it," the man said. "No, wait. It's purple, not orange. Damn thing. Purple." Eli looked around for a pen and paper, but they were standing in the kitchenette, and the nearby area only held the usual trappings of a workplace kitchen. He repeated the address verbally, committing it to memory. "And the house is purple, not orange." "Yes," the man confirmed, his voice turning cool and metallic as he calmed down. I'm so glad you're coming over. My friends won't visit on account of the poltergeists. If I'm out when you get here, use the key under the welcome mat. Just let ourselves in? Break a window if you have to. I need this problem taken care of." The phone went cool in Eli's hand, and the caller was gone. Eli still hadn't found anything to use for writing down the address. "I need a pen." Con took a noisy sip of his hot tea, then said, 78, 1, 9, 14, Octopus, 91. Gah! Eli yelled. Those numbers were nothing like the ones he'd just memorized. Con grinned. 507 Ocean Drive Parkway, 16th Street, 23rd Annual Bluegrass Festival, 8:12. Eli tucked his phone between his teeth and covered both of his ears with his hands. He ran to the front of the shop that way. He grabbed a felt pen and quickly scrawled the address on his inner forearm. He didn't use paper because getting paper would take too long. Shaking his head, he put away the phone and returned to the kitchen. "Got it," he said, showing Con his forearm. Con handed him a mug of herbal tea, which Eli gratefully accepted. From the look of amusement on Con's face, Eli knew the day's slam-dunk job wouldn't be without its hiccups. He needed the tea to replenish his moisture levels, so he could flood his crack with sweat several more times that day. "You did a decent job," Con said. "This case is going to be an easy one, so relax. We're in, we're out. Nobody gets hurt." "Do you always charge so much?" "Let's get through the first day before we start discussing your raise." "Well, I didn't mean it like that. Just trying to get myself up to speed. I'm still not exactly sure what my job is." "Me neither. I'm making everything up as I go." "Really?" Con smirked. He reached over to an intercom next to the refrigerator and pressed a button. "Hey, Val!" She grunted a non-verbal response. With his finger off the intercom button, Con explained to Eli, "Val can be intense when she's focused on something. When you give her instructions, make sure she repeats everything back to you, but in her own summary, not word for word." "Sure." Eli couldn't imagine himself giving Valentine instructions, but he was familiar with that method, as Brenda used it on him. Con spoke into the intercom. "Can you call and reschedule the job we had booked for today? Another one fell into our lap just now. A total open and shut case. Super easy. Our new hire's going to get his confidence built up today." "You're not going to the bowling alley?" She sighed. "Fine. I'll let him know." Con thanked her and let go of the button. The lights overhead flickered. He pushed the intercom button again. "Val, was that you?" She let out a laugh. It wasn't a girly giggle either. It was a throaty, head-tossed-back, mad scientist cackle. Just when Eli thought he couldn't appreciate Valentine more, he did. Con shook his head and eyed the ceiling lights with suspicion. "As you may have guessed, I'm the muscle and logistics, while my genius sister designs and builds all the ghost hacking tech." "She doesn't go out on the jobs? Ever?" "No way. She's too valuable to put in the field. I need someone who's expendable, a red shirt." "And that's me." "Without Val's traps and beacons, we're nothing. And it's an arms race, believe me. The ghosts are constantly evolving. Our first-generation tech wouldn't stand a chance with today's para-electrical elements." Eli sipped his tea and listened. Con began to pace. "There are evolutionary forces at work, and you know what that means. The strongest will survive. Only it's not always the strongest, is it? Not the way we think of strength. No, it's the wiliest, the stickiest, the nasty little things that get into corners and breed like cockroaches until we're overrun." "The ghosts are breeding?" "They have to be. Either that or all the rooms at the hotel are booked, if you know what I mean." Eli shook his head. No, he didn't know what Con meant. "Standing room only," Con said. "Val understands. That's why she does what she does." "How did she learn about this stuff? Did your dad invent some of those things?" Khan's eyes got wide under raised eyebrows. He gestured for Eli to step in close. "Nobody knows how she figured everything out," he whispered. "Ever since she was old enough to grip a screwdriver, she's been taking things apart to build other stuff. She's one of those, what do you call it?" "Savant?" Khan nodded solemnly. "Yeah, that's it." He chugged his tea and slammed the cup down on the counter. "Time to roll out and catch us a poltergeist, my man." Eli finished his tea in one gulp, then followed Khan through the shop. Khan handed him camouflage print bags full of heavy stuff, which Eli strapped onto his shoulders. Eli commented, "This is a lot more stuff than we took out to Mr. Quentin's house." "It's the right amount of stuff. If the guy's got psychosis from alcohol, there won't be any ghosts. All the more reason to have the right gear." Eli shrugged under the weighty bags. "Let's say there are poltergeists there. Are they really bad? Aren't they the ones who rearrange your kitchen stuff?" Khan stopped in front of a cabinet and opened the doors. Without looking back at Eli, he said, "Poltergeists rearrange kitchen stuff, pantry stuff, and then your internal organs, stomach and intestines, pulled out so they can play with everything. Get it? They go with a digestion theme." Eli didn't like the sound of that, even if Khan was only pulling his leg. He liked his internal organs where they were, and his external organs too, for that matter. He eyed the mysterious things Khan was tossing into a bag. There were 6 identical objects that looked like stereo speakers, but with domed tops. Next was a white case with a first aid cross on the side. "First aid?" Eli said. "Are you sure this whole ghost hacking thing is safe?" Khan zipped up the bag. "Who said anything about being safe? Where's the fun in that?" "I don't know any first aid." "That makes 2 of us. I only take the kit with me to keep Val happy." "Well, that doesn't sound smart." Khan clapped Eli on the back between the shoulder blades. "Let's go. I'll drive." They stepped out from the front door of the shop. It was a perfect spring day, with the air outside being the same as ideal room temperature. Eli took out the keys to the van and held them for a moment. Khan was a terrible driver, and there was a good chance they'd get in a fender bender before they arrived at the address for the poltergeists. "Keys," Khan demanded. Eli knew he shouldn't hand over the keys, but he couldn't say no to Khan. Chapter 6. Khan started the van's engine and lurched out of the parking spot with all the care and safety precautions of an amateur lumberjack on Christmas Eve, stealing a coniferous tree from the neighbor's lawn. Eli buckled his seatbelt. He kept his hands low on his lap and his eyes on the safety airbag packed tightly into the dash. They drove for a few minutes without incident before Eli remembered to check his inner forearm for the client's address. His sweat had caused the numbers to smear, but they were still legible. He leaned over and programmed the address into the vehicle's navigation panel. "Is the term client or customer?" Eli asked. When people say client, it sends a certain message. Drug dealers have a clientele. Lawyers call their criminal defendants clients on the witness stand. Client sounds like a euphemism. Okay, customer it is. The navigation system automatically included the day's date, and Eli added Ghost Hackers, customer number 1, to the address in the database. Khan frowned at the navigation display as he crossed 3 lanes without using the signal light. Better make it client, after all. Customer makes it sound like they're buying a ghost from us. But it's already in there. I'll have to drill down through 3 menus to change the label. Khan grumbled an order. Do it like the devil wins a court case. What? The devil wins a court case without arguing, Eli. Eli thought about that for a minute while he scrolled through the menus and changed the label. In this hypothetical court case, was the devil the prosecutor or the defendant? Well, that question pretty much answered itself. But if the devil was so powerful, how did he let himself get arrested and charged in the first place? Was it all an elaborate ruse to get more souls? Khan took a detour from the route and careened the van into a parking lot. They were at an army surplus store Eli had seen before, but never really noticed. The store looked like the kind of place where Khan bought all his clothes, so Eli wasn't surprised when they walked in and a guy greeted Khan by name, shouting it across the store, jubilantly. "Diesel!" Khan yelled back. "Did you ever get those angry polyps checked out?" "I think I'll keep them, actually. One of them looks like you, and the other one's handsome." Khan and Diesel did an elaborate multi-step handshake and finished by bumping chests. "Check out my new hire," Khan said, nodding at Eli. "Low mileage. Thinks on his feet. Can take a full blast from the booster without crying." Eli beamed with pride. So many nice things were being said about him. He shook Diesel's hand. Diesel was approximately 40, broad in the chest, and looked and smelled like he just completed a 48-hour road trip. He had long, thick black hair pulled back and tied with what appeared to be a garbage bag twist tie. He had a thick stubble of facial hair, mostly dark, but with 2 white lightning bolts on either side of his mouth. Eli experienced a strange wave of recognition that would be incredibly awkward to explain. You see, whenever he played a video game that allowed him to choose an avatar, he'd built this man, Diesel, from the boxer shorts up. The resemblance was uncanny, and the name Diesel was even better than anything he'd come up with. Eli looked away quickly, embarrassed by his awe. "Great shop you've got here," Eli said, his voice deeper than it had ever been, scratching new depths on his vocal cords. He glanced around at the racks of cargo pants, olive green T-shirts, and broken-in boots. The 3 of them were the only ones in the warehouse-style store. The only other sound was the whir of the ceiling fans high overhead. Khan said something in a low voice to Diesel, who then walked over to one of the clothing racks and started tossing olive green garments at Eli. "Anything with a stain is half price," Diesel said. His voice was as unique and manly as the white lightning bolts in his beard. Eli ran his fingertips across the soft T-shirt fabric, noting the telltale piling. All these clothes had been previously worn, which was not a desired quality in a garment for Eli. But he wanted to make his new boss happy, so he took the clothes and walked over to the curtained-off changing rooms. He looked in the mirror at himself and the clothes he'd thrown on that morning in the rush to leave the apartment, his polyester short pants and work uniform shirt. Apparently, he'd been on autopilot. As he stripped down and tried on the new-to-him clothes, he thought about this notion of autopilot. He did a lot of things while in that mode, only slightly more conscious than Brenda during her alleged sleepwalking/sleep-eating. What was autopilot anyway? He disappeared sometimes when he was driving, and that couldn't be safe. He'd be thinking about the storyline from one of his comic books, lost in another world, then would notice the clanging of the underground parkade's gate opening. He wouldn't remember the drive home, so who or what had been driving the van? Eli stared at himself in the room's narrow mirror. There. He'd gone on autopilot yet again. He was wearing army surplus clothes, and he didn't remember putting them on. He turned from side to side, checking himself out. His medium brown hair looked glossy in the store's bright lighting. Despite a few stains on the T-shirt, he looked good. Really good. In fact, he had a strong feeling that somewhere out in the big world, somebody was creating a video game avatar that looked exactly like Eli Carter. This made him smile. He could hear Khan and Diesel arguing over something on the other side of the curtain. They had to be talking about a video game because Eli could swear he heard the word ray gun. Chapter 7. When Eli stepped out of the changing room, he found Khan and Diesel wrestling on the bare concrete floor of the store. Eli quickly looked away, embarrassed. He browsed the nearby racks, selected some more clothes to try on, and went back into the changing room. The guys kept wrestling and grunting. Being an only child, Eli hadn't wrestled with siblings. Being a social outcast, he hadn't wrestled much with friends either. Most of his play wrestling happened with his girlfriend, in bed, which would explain his discomfort at seeing the guys locked in a playful embrace. He tried on more clothes and took a photo of himself to send Brenda to get her opinion. He expected her to hate everything, but she replied back with a simple message, "Hot." Eli imagined there would be more wrestling in his future. On the other side of the curtain, Diesel and Khan had resolved their differences and were taking free shots with a basketball. Eli made his clothing choices, came out, and paid for everything. He kept on one of his new army surplus outfits, right down to the pre-worn socks inside his new-to-him boots. He folded up his delivery uniform to stuff in a bag, even though he wanted to dramatically toss the polyester clothes into a garbage can. Diesel gave him the 50% stain discount, but then said he was adding a 10% surcharge for being friends with Khan. Eli assumed the guy was joking, but when he got out to the van and reviewed his receipt, he saw the charge on the paper. "Friends with Khan, 10% bastard charge." Eli said. "What now?" Khan steered the van into a spin-out in the near-empty parking lot. "Never mind." Eli's goal for the day was to be a good employee and impress his new boss. Complaining wasn't in the plan. "Eager to get to work?" Khan launched the van onto the busy street, narrowly missing a city bus. "I'm glad we got that poltergeist call. This is going to be an easy one." "A slam dunk, you said." "And a home run." "I just want to do a good job so you don't regret hiring me." "This job is so easy, you could probably do it without me. What do you think, my man? Could you do it without me?" Eli looked down at the receipt in his hand. "Without you, I would have saved 10% on these clothes." Khan grabbed the receipt, read it, and laughed loud enough to drown out the angry honking from the cars he was cutting off as he wove through traffic. "This is going to be a piece of cake," Khan said as he turned onto the client street. "A walk in the park." He pulled the van up to the house. "Easy peasy." Eli pressed his lips together to keep from arguing. It had been a 30-minute drive, and he was sick of hearing about how straightforward and easy this job was going to be. Sick of it, and worried. Khan wasn't just tempting fate. He was giving fate rude hand gestures while hitting on its girlfriend. They both jumped out of the van and started unloading the bags through the sliding passenger side door. Khan nodded toward the house and said, "Not bad." The home was painted purple and looked to be 3 stories, including the attic. Its classic heritage style was popular with the restoration crowd. This one had either been lovingly maintained through its century of existence or carefully restored. Each segment of the exterior had a different shape of wood shingle, painted in hues of purple. The gingerbread trim curling around the eaves was a pale acid yellow green. Eli would not have guessed those shades of purple and green looked so perfect together, but they did. As they walked up the front walkway, a car with muffler problems grumbled along the street behind them, followed by 2 cars street racing, drivers and passengers yelling out of the windows. Eli looked up at the stained glass windows on the middle floor, then down at the empty liquor bottles discarded in the home's meticulously weeded flower garden. This place was what Brenda would call a dream home in a compromised neighborhood. Khan pressed the button for the doorbell. Instead of bells or chimes, the house emitted an angry buzz. Khan jabbed the doorbell in a staccato rhythm. The house buzzed like a hornet's nest, being struck by tennis balls. After a full minute of buzzing, Khan turned to Eli. "Are you sure you got the right address?" Eli held up his arm. The numbers scrawled on his skin matched the swirly wrought iron numbers on the house. But were the numbers on his arm correct? Back when he'd taken the call, Khan had rattled off random numbers to mess him up. And again, Eli had been sure of the address when he wrote it down. There'd been no doubt in his mind, and this house was purple, just like the guy had said. Eli gestured for Khan to step back off the welcome mat. "He said to let ourselves in and to get started if he wasn't home." He pulled back the edge of the mat. Lo and behold, there was the key. The late morning sun glinted off the metal surface, making it shine like a beacon. This had to be the house. "Are you sure?" Khan asked. Another noisy old car, full of yelling people, rolled down the street behind them. "Here's why I'm sure," Eli said. "This isn't the kind of neighborhood where everyone leaves a key under the mat." "There you go. Thinking on your feet. Just like I told Diesel. I sure know how to pick 'em." Eli knocked on the door one more time, then unlocked it with the key. "Were you even looking for someone when I came by last week? I didn't see a help wanted sign in the window." "I'm always looking." Khan led the way into the house. No wonder he didn't balk at the price. Nice place. The home was as attractive inside as it was on the exterior. The odor of new construction hung in the air, the scent of fresh paint and fresh finish on the gleaming hardwood floors. Khan pointed to the child-sized boots and shoes scattered throughout the home's entryway. "A father's got to protect his kids." He picked up a child's yellow rubber boot and frowned. "That's odd." Eli peered around the corner, into the living room. It was bigger than his entire apartment, which gave him a pang of space envy. The room held contemporary furniture with square lines, but not so square as to clash with the gracious old home with its tall baseboards and high ceilings. The dark wood floors were clean and smooth, and it seemed like the sort of place where you'd take your shoes off. So Eli set down the bags and knelt to remove his new-to-him boots. "That's odd," Khan repeated, still holding the yellow boot. Eli pretended to be very concerned with the black shoelaces on his boots. Khan very clearly wanted Eli to ask what was odd, but Eli didn't want to walk into another prank. He wanted to open the bags of gear and get down to business. Khan said, continuing to toss out verbal bait. "Very odd indeed." Eli kept his back to Khan and unzipped the bag he'd carried in. The contents included a black box that looked like a car battery, the booster box they'd used at Mr. Quinton's house, as well as a smaller version of the same thing. Eli shuddered involuntarily at the memory of being zapped by the big one. There wasn't much else in the bag, except for silicone-tipped barbecue tongs, yards of wires and cables, plus a spray bottle. He shook the bottle and sniffed the nozzle. The smell was instantly recognizable as the thing Brenda sprayed on things she ironed. The scent was lavender, and Eli felt a surge of pride for recognizing it, with bonus points for remembering the word lavender. Khan had moved on from the residents' shoes and was walking around the main floor, looking up at the ceiling and tilting his head to one side and then the other. He wasn't explaining anything, so Eli asked, "What's this lavender water for?" Khan snorted. "Lavender water is for laundry. What you hold in your hand is watered down. Well, never mind what it is. There are a few uses for the paraspray. Ghosts love it. The airborne ones, anyway." "Oh." Eli sniffed it again, detecting nothing other than lavender. "Should I go and spritz it around the house or something?" "Let's check something else first." Khan beckoned for Eli to follow him into the living room. The living room was bright, with sunshine pouring in from a single large window. Neither this room nor the house in general felt very haunted to Eli. He wondered if this was the right address. It was obvious a young family lived here. Eli had imagined the client as a much older man, but unless a grandfather lived here with the family, Eli had wrongly guessed the client's age. "Maybe this is the wrong house," Eli said. "I'll call the client back right now." Con ignored him, taking interest in something at the room's window. Eli pulled his phone out and tried to call the client. Unfortunately, the call had come in with a blocked number. Having been a delivery driver for years, he knew how to solve a problem like this. Step 1, you call dispatch. He did a quick search for the phone number for ghost hackers, programmed it in, and called. Valentine picked up the phone. "Hello, this is Ghost Hackers." Her tone was a thin veneer of politeness over an undertow of dark rage at having been interrupted from her work. It sounded like this to Eli. "Hello, this is Ghost Hackers. Please kill yourself and never phone this number again." Eli burst out with apologies and rapidly explained the situation. He asked if Valentine could get the client's phone number from when he'd called the landline. She groaned and muttered under her breath about new employees costing her time rather than saving it. She put him on hold by dropping the phone on the desk. He waited, listening to her tap away at a keyboard. After 2 minutes, she picked up again and asked Eli for the address he was currently at. He checked his forearm and gave the address. "Yep, that's it," she said. "The call came from the landline at that address." Eli's left eye twitched. He had a feeling she was telling him that so she could get back to whatever she was doing, but he wasn't about to call her a liar. He thanked her and ended the call. "Valentine said this is the place," he told Con. "Relax. This job's going to be easy." Eli clapped his hands. "Bring on the poltergeists." Con nodded for Eli to come over to the window. He pointed to a tray of sprouting seedlings on the low, wide windowsill. "Want to see something cool?" "Course I want to see something cool. That's a huge part of why I accepted this job." Con grinned, all square teeth and dimples. "I thought you accepted the job because you had a crush on Val." "Your sister is beautiful, but she's way out of my league. Also, I have a girlfriend that I live with, Brenda. She's small, and sometimes she kicks me in the kidneys, but it hurts my feelings more than it hurts me physically." Eli paused, aware that he was blathering, yet unable to stop himself for longer than it took to inhale. "All the other girls I've dated dumped me within a week or two, and Brenda was the only one who stuck. We slept together on our 3rd date." Eli wanted to stop blathering, but Con was such a good listener. "The first time only took 42 seconds. I know because I was counting." Eli grimaced, but still the words kept pouring from him with about as much control as he'd had over himself on that fateful 3rd date. "It wasn't anything like how you imagine it will be. There was a lot of apologizing." Finally, with a tightening of his throat, the confession slowed. Eli swallowed, then concluded with, "Speaking of apologizing, I'm very sorry I just told you all that." Con's grin hadn't faltered. He just nodded and pulled from his pocket a teeny-tiny silver pistol. It looked to Eli like a novelty cigarette lighter. The item was, in fact, not a novelty cigarette lighter, but Eli whistled and said, "Sweet lighter." Anyway, Con raised one eyebrow. "Did you say 42 seconds? "I'd like for you to forget I said any of that. And please don't tell Valentine. I don't think it's possible for a person to die of embarrassment, but I'd rather not find out." "Oh, a person can definitely die of embarrassment," Con said, with an air of authority. "Ever hear of spontaneous human combustion? You can read about it in some of our old case files." Eli straightened up and stuck out his chest. Embarrassment hadn't killed him yet, and with the quantity he'd endured, his current existence seemed a miracle. Con held the silver gun in one hand while he arranged the potted seedlings into a straight line. "Prepare to be amazed." He grabbed the nearby watering can and doused the plants in water. "Diesel didn't want to part with his latest find, but I twisted his arm while you were in the changing room. Literally." "You were fighting over that thing?" Eli leaned forward to take a closer look at the miniature gun. "I thought you were talking about a video game." "He said I'd accidentally shoot myself with it." "With a cigarette lighter?" "You think I'd wrestle that smelly buttwad over a cigarette lighter? Some of his dank breath went straight up my nose. My taste buds won't be the same for days." He turned the shiny object so that it glinted in the sunshine. "This is the real deal." "A real gun?" Eli asked. "Is it loaded?" "Not with bullets. And technically, it's not a gun. Exactly. More like a delivery system. Watch what it does to these garden seedlings." Eli took a step back and cast a guilty look around the room. He had let himself into someone else's family home to hunt down alleged poltergeists, and he wasn't 100% sure it was even the right house. They should have been proceeding with caution, not shooting innocent houseplants. Con aimed carefully, holding the comically small gun as if it were a deadly weapon. "3," he said, "2, and—" Chapter 8. Con pulled the trigger. The room flashed with a dazzling light so bright and strangely illuminating it gave Eli the gift of supersight. Now he could see straight through the family's square, clean-lined sofa cushions to the change that had fallen between the cracks, 1 quarter and 2 dimes. His vision took him even further, through the floorboards, down to the crawl space beneath the house. A raccoon slumbered there, curled up like a cat. She was expecting a litter of 3, not yet born. Eli blinked and blinked. The raccoon stirred in her sleep, lifted her head, and seemed to look right at him. The floorboards came back, then the frame of the couch, the change beneath the seats, the cushions and pillows, and the whole living room. Eli's vision was back to normal. There must have been a sound with the blast because his ears were ringing now. Con said excitedly, "Look! Look! You're missing it." Missing what? There was more? More than seeing through walls and into living things? Eli wheeled around, still blinking rapidly. The plants, which had been tiny seedlings no more than an inch tall, were already a foot high and growing like they were on a time-lapse video. Tendrils snaked out, budded, and burst with pale green leaves. Con whooped with joy and quickly added more water to the pots. The growth was soundless, which made Eli wonder if he was imagining this, hallucinating. He reached out to touch a leaf, and a vine wrapped itself around his finger. The growing plant whipped its way up his arm. "Gah!" Eli said. "It likes you." The plant continued to grow, its speed increasing. The vine tickled as it passed under his armpit, then looped around his neck and chin. Eli meant to say, "Con, should I do something? Is this plant about to murder and eat me?" Instead, he pushed one intrusive vine out of his mouth with his tongue and repeated, "Gah!" "Stop horsing around." Con tucked the tiny pistol into his waistband. "Okay, enough fun and games. I'm not paying you to grow zucchinis on your head." A yellow flower blossomed in front of Eli's right eye. He didn't know much about gardening, or he'd have corrected Con and said it was a squash plant, not a zucchini. But instead, he just said, "Gah!" "Do you think any of these are tomatoes?" Con leaned over the rapidly growing plants. Roots poked through the sod pots, and the new leaves now blanketed the entire window, darkening the living room in an ominous manner. Eli shook himself into action and began unraveling the vines from his head, carefully so as not to damage the plant. He found his voice and asked, "What was that gun? And when do I get to use it? How is this even possible?" He let out a nervous, excited laugh. How have I not heard of this revolutionary technology? Khan pulled the gun back out of his waistband and offered it to Eli. It's a ray gun. You get to use it. Never. If I told you how it worked, you wouldn't believe me. And lastly, you don't know about these things because you never asked. Eli accepted the object with care. Ray gun. Cool. He rubbed his sweating palms on his cargo pants, one at a time, so the gadget didn't slip from his grasp. He looked closer at the shiny side of the barrel, which held an engraving, number 112, Azure. Khan's eyes went wide as he noticed the gun pointing at him. He jumped sideways. Careful, my man. If you kill me now, you'll never get that raise. Eli pointed the gun down at the floor, the way he should have held it from the start. His cheeks grew hot under Khan's admonishment. He should have known how to hold a gun, because he'd taken that gun safety course back when... Actually, Eli hadn't taken a gun safety course. Why were these ideas in his head? He shook another vine off his arm, then vigorously slapped away the one that was getting too friendly with his leg. The memory of the gun safety course slipped away like bathwater. Had he seen it in a documentary? No, it was something else. The realization came to him with a flash of cold sweat. The gun safety course was a Donnie memory. Before he'd become a junkie, he'd taken a number of training courses. Eli clenched his free hand into a fist. That bastard Donnie! He'd let him in as a favor, so Donnie could hug his father and say goodbye, and now he repaid Eli's kindness by leaving a pile of crap in his head. And it was crap. If the memories had been the useful kind, he would have remembered the gun safety tip before Eli embarrassed himself by pointing a loaded weapon at his friend. Are you wondering why it's called a ray gun? Khan asked. Well, I am now. They're all named after their creator, Ray Kuragawa. He was the lead designer at Azure Technologies before they, the prototypes were never named, just numbered. Ray was a kick-ass guy, obviously. Well, obviously. Khan took back the pistol and aimed it at the plants. Eli narrowed his eyes and waited for the flash, but Khan didn't pull the trigger. This is an agricultural tool, Khan said. Ray Kuragawa could have made number 112 look like anything, and he chose a toy pistol. He chuckled. Kick-ass. Azure Technologies. Sounds familiar. Yep. Their headquarters were dead center in the crashdown zone. They were on the top floor of the first building that crushed in on itself. Patient zero, so to speak. But not Ray, right? I mean, he got out, didn't he? Khan's look said that no, he did not. The world lost a lot of remarkable human beings that day. And some bankers, too. But not enough to balance the scales. Eli looked over at the still-growing plants. Now the roots were bursting the bottoms of the sod containers and snaking toward his feet. Eli got the feeling he wanted to sit down and have someone bring him a glass of water. Between seeing the shocking power of ray gun number 112 and getting hit with another dose of Donnie's memories, today's excitement was getting to him. His eyes were still boogedy from the bright flash. A blurry shape seemed to be moving around the living room. Eli blinked repeatedly, but his eyeballs remained boogedy. Boogedy was a word he'd learned from his adoptive father, and even though it was a nonsense word, he'd never figured out a better descriptor for when a part of your body is beyond hinky, but not entirely borked. Khan cleared his throat and said softly, Are you seeing that? His gaze was aimed at the blurry glowing shape currently moving into the corner of the room, toward an overflowing toy box. Eli stood very still, his breathing shallow. The blurry thing was real. Eli's sweat glands decided to assist in this emergency the only way they knew how. They produced sweat and flooded his butt crack. "There," Con whispered. Eli replied in an equally hushed tone, "Yes, I see something shimmering over by the toy box. Is that you know what?" "The poltergeist. You can say poltergeist." "I didn't want to offend it." "What politically correct term would you suggest?" "Never mind. I don't need you making this more complicated than it needs to be. I told you, Eli, this is an easy one. Textbook easy." "I should get a copy of that textbook." "It's more a figure of speech, but that's a good idea. I'll get you trained up and you write a textbook for your successor, in case something grisly happens to you." Eli took his eyes off the glowing, foggy form to look over at Con. "Well, we found the poltergeist. Are you going to shoot it or what? Where's the ray gun?" "Shoot it? With the ray gun?" Con let out a wheezy chuckle. "That's the last thing we want to do. I have no idea what would happen. But if you want to, say, increase the poltergeist's size and strength by a factor of 100, go for it, my man." He kept staring in the direction of the toy box, while the corners of his mouth twisted up. "To whom should I address your box of scraped-up remains? Did you say your girlfriend's name is Brenda?" "That ray gun's not for shooting poltergeists? Then why do you even have it? What's the point?" "How many comic books do you own, Eli?" Eli nodded. Point taken. He closed his mouth and waited for further instruction. As they watched, the foggy form settled down and disappeared inside the toy box. "There we go," Con said. "I'll go get the hexapods, and you dig through that toy box and find the vessel." "Explain it to me like I'm stupid. The vessel?" "Poltergeists are basically paranormal hermit crabs. They like to hang out inside something. Look for a creepy old doll with eyes that look at you, or a jack-in-the-box. I know it's cliché, but poltergeists aren't known for their originality." Eli took a step toward the toy box before his body realized the mission and locked up. How could he be so excited in a good way, yet scared at the same time? "Keep an eye on your intestines," Con warned. Oh, right. The danger part was scary. "So look for creepy things?" Eli asked, stalling for time and courage. "Use your intuition." "What about equipment? You have those sensors and stuff." "Are you stalling because you're scared?" "Yes." "You need to get over that if you're going to keep doing this." "I know." Eli inched toward the toy box. The room was now dim, due to the overgrown plants blocking the main window. He paused by a side table and switched on a lamp. The light bulb crackled and flickered, then held steady. "Try breathing." Con stood watching from the doorway. Eli stopped holding his breath and inhaled, which did help, actually. "Use your intuition," Con repeated. "And there's a temperature shift in possessed objects. Sort of like it feels hot and cold at the same time." "Mr. Quentin's microwave felt like that." Eli reached the toy box and knelt down to open the lid. "Okay," he said, as much to himself as to Con. "I can do this." Because he couldn't lie, he had to believe himself, and so confidence rushed in to Eli Carter. Armed with his confidence, he began digging through the full toy box. If he were a poltergeist, what sort of toy would he curl up inside? Some toys were intrinsically more fun than others, such as dollhouses and things with wheels. Within seconds, he was pleasantly absorbed in the task. Eli didn't notice Con leave to check the other rooms, nor did he notice a wispy fog slip out of the toy box. He patiently inspected each item in the toy box, while the white fog turned orange and streamed over to the room's fireplace. It swirled up and funneled into the orange model train caboose sitting on the room's fireplace mantel. Chapter 9. Eli's search through the toy box yielded no results, unless you counted fun as a result. He particularly liked the functioning miniature cash register and the sounds it made. After he'd checked everything from the toy box twice, he left the living room in search of his boss. He found Khan in the home's kitchen and gave him a report. Khan was scanning the interior of the family's microwave, using the same tool he'd used at Mr. Quentin's house. "Good call on the microwave," Eli said. Khan grumbled. "I'm getting nothing. So much for this being a slam-dunk job." He rubbed his eyes. "The ghost is being shy. Because it's daytime? Would you hook up that booster box thing to wake it up or whatever?" "Boosting the juice is dangerous." Eli's arm convulsed again at the memory of being zapped by the thing. "No kidding. There's a world of difference between the wandering spirit of the recently deceased and a poltergeist." He leaned against the counter by the sink and rubbed his eyes again. "And then there's plain old craziness. Did the client sound crazy to you?" "Mostly agitated." Eli looked around the kitchen in problem-solving mode. He went to the cupboard where he'd keep vitamins and medication if he lived there, and looked inside. "Good idea," Khan said, and they both looked through the family's medications and vitamins. There wasn't anything stronger than painkillers prescribed by a dentist, and that bottle held 5 of its 6 pills. As they put the bottles back, Khan suddenly pointed to the microwave and said, "What was that?" Eli turned to check the digital readout, which was still blank. When he turned back, he saw that the bottle of painkillers was gone. "Too bad your first official job isn't going so well," Khan said quickly. "The thing about poltergeists is they love paraprofessionals. They love to show off. I expected things to be flying off shelves within minutes of us getting here." "It could be something else, maybe a recently deceased. I should have gone through the questionnaire when I had him on the phone." Eli walked over to the fridge, which was covered in children's art and colorful magnets. "I can check for memorial stuff or other clues." He leaned in to read a grocery list. The handwritten list contained the usual things: milk, bread, Oreo cookies. At the bottom, in messy block letters, was the word engine. That struck Eli as odd, but he didn't know what to make of it. Khan looked in some more cupboards, then stopped. "This is pointless," he said. "Maybe what we saw in the living room was just retinal damage from the ray gun. We should have worn eye protection." Eli looked around the brightly lit family kitchen. The place didn't feel haunted or creepy in any way. If anything, it made him want to stay and hang out, maybe have a beer and check out the attic. The attic. "You checked the attic?" Eli asked. "Done." Khan opened the fridge. "Ooh, pickled eggs." "What? Does that mean a poltergeist got in there and did something to the eggs?" Khan pulled a big jar from the fridge and set it on the kitchen island. Inside the jar, pickled eggs bobbed around in pale green liquid. "It means we've got lunch," Khan said. He yanked open 3 drawers before he found the forks, and then he dug into the jar. "You eat the client's food?" "Babysitter's rules. We're basically paranormal babysitters." "You have to get permission from the parents. The rule is you're allowed to eat something if you're there for a mealtime, but you still have to ask." Khan sprinkled some salt on his egg and ate it in 2 bites. "What do you know about babysitting?" "I used to look after some kids in the building where I grew up. Parents trusted me because—" Eli forced himself to pause that confession. Although he blurted out way too much about his intimate life, he was more careful about who he talked to about his microchip secret. People never treated him the same once they knew, and they certainly never told him anything private. Most didn't want anything to do with him. Brenda was different. She actually told him that he'd spoiled her for all other people because she could never trust anyone like she did him. Khan was back in the fridge again, whooping over the treasure trove of leftovers. "Pepperoni pizza? No way!" "What do you want me to do now?" "Watch me eat and make me feel bad." Khan handed the pizza box to Eli. "Or you could always eat up, my man." Eli didn't feel right about eating someone else's leftovers, But he didn't feel wrong, either, because nothing tastes as good as saturated fat and triple your daily allowance of sodium. After lunch, they both returned to the living room, where Con used the handheld scanner to check all the toy box items. Eli watched, scowling. He wanted to hold the scanner, but Con wouldn't let him. He felt fidgety. The same personality traits that made him unsuitable for a desk job also made him unsuitable for standing around doing nothing. He checked on the plants by the windowsill. They'd stopped growing at an accelerated rate, but they did need water. He took the watering can to the kitchen to refill it. As he stood at the sink, Eli heard someone come into the kitchen behind him. The back of his hand tickled. He whipped around. Nobody was there. He continued filling the watering can, and he sighed dramatically and leaned forward onto his elbows on the counter. The back of his head tickled some more. With his eyes lower, he used the reflective surface of the nearby toaster to watch the space behind him. Something orange flicked by. His eyes widened, and his breath caught in his throat. The orange shape flicked by again. Eli was so excited he shouted, "Ghost! Con, come quick! It's in the kitchen!" A moment later, Con strolled in, looking annoyed. "Not funny." Eli kept scanning the room with his eyes, high and low. "I'm not joking around. I was right here, leaning forward, and I saw something orange go by in the reflection on the toaster." "Poltergeists aren't orange. You'll have to do better." "Maybe it's not a poltergeist. Maybe it's something else." Con shook his head. "Don't make things more difficult than they need to be. This is a slam-dunk case. The client reported multiple destructive entities rearranging household objects. Either there's nothing here, or we're going to find these poltergeists and catch them with the hexapods. When it's done, you're going to thank me for selecting such an easy job for your first official day. Then we're going to celebrate by supporting the city's stripper economy." "It was orange." "Sure it was." Con left the kitchen and went back to the living room to continue scanning. Eli lingered in the kitchen, his annoyance simmering. He was tempted to tell Con about the microchip so his employer would know he wasn't lying, but revealing that secret was just too large of a sacrifice. There was a good chance it would also get him fired, and he didn't want to get fired. At least not until he knew what hexapods were. After 5 minutes of waiting for the ghost to show again, Eli gave up and went to water the plants. They perked up with the moisture, but didn't do anything unusual. Con was still scanning toys. Specifically, he was playing with the miniature cash register, which made sense. A person would have to be made of stone to resist pushing those little buttons. Eli went over to the couch and lifted up the cushion. He found a quarter and 2 dimes, just as he'd seen when the ray gun had flashed. He left the coins and put the cushions back. Con held up a teddy bear in one hand, scanning it with the tool held in his other. "Does that tickle?" he asked the bear. "If you were just going to scan everything anyway, why did you have me go through that stuff by hand?" Con moved on to the next toy. "Beginner pilots don't start off using the fancy software that flies commercial jets. They learn how to actually, fly." Eli looked down at his hands. Even if he could find the object a poltergeist was hiding inside, like a paranormal hermit crab, what good were his bare hands after that? The memory of fighting for his life against the cat wraith was still vivid. Eli's hands had passed right through the thing, even though it could touch him. How was that even possible? "Con, I need to tell you something. The person that I know who has a cat wraith, well, it's my girlfriend. That means that I have a cat wraith. I believe it slept at the foot of my bed last night. There were some little hairs on the covers. I would have brought them in for you, but they sort of evaporated." "Figures. Cat wraiths like to play their games." Eli got a bad feeling in his stomach, on top of the pain he was already experiencing from eating so much cheese. "You don't seem surprised that I have a cat wraith." Con kept scanning toys. "Nothing surprises me anymore. I'm unsurprisable. I believe you had something to do with me getting a cat wraith. Khan shrugged. Believe whatever you want. He turned and offered Eli the scanner. Here, press the button only when you're scanning. Don't just hold it down the whole time or you'll waste the battery. Eli accepted the device with a smile. A devious idea bubbled up in the scheming area of Eli's brain. Khan had seemingly softened toward him at the mention of the cat wraith. Perhaps he had some guilt over sending a nearly lethal paranormal entity home with an innocent person. Eli could use this guilt to his advantage, if he was careful. He pushed the scheme aside for a moment and tried out the scanner on a pail of Legos. Upon closer inspection, the scanner appeared to be a modified remote control. Eli pressed the button marked Scan. With no warning, the device vibrated in his hand. Go! Eli dropped the vibrating scanner on his foot. Khan snatched the device from the floor, cursing a streak of nasty words. Eli apologized. He'd been apologizing a lot that day, which didn't make him feel good at all. It's fine, Khan growled. That's enough touching stuff for one day, though. Eli quietly retreated to a safe distance and took a seat on the couch, with his hands folded on his lap. He sat there for the next hour as Khan scanned and rescanned all the toys and the other objects in the room, including everything on the mantel. Nothing, Khan said, glumly. He took a seat in the reclining chair across from Eli and put his feet up on the coffee table. What if we had found the right vessel? Do you burn it or bury it or what? A good exterminator doesn't catch vermin and release them next door. Eli whispered, You kill them? Khan raised one dark eyebrow and ran his hand through his spiked white hair. You can't kill what's not alive, but you can rehome the little pests. Sort of. Stay there. I'll show you. Khan stood up, and Eli braced himself to be tasered, shocked, blasted, burned, jolted, or electrocuted in some way. But Khan wasn't using some scary device on him, after all. He jogged off to grab one of the gear bags. He returned and set some objects on the coffee table between them. These are hexapods, he explained. He arranged 6 black objects the size of small stereo speakers or large soup cans in a circular formation. The tops were domed. He flicked a switch at the bottom of each one. A soft hum filled the room. The hum was soothing, like one of those relaxation recordings, the ones with the glass bowls, not whale sounds. Whale sounds gave Eli the heebie-jeebies. Khan used the spray bottle Eli had seen earlier to spritz the area above them. The air misted up, and now there were narrow beams of light visible, emanating from the hexapods. Next, Khan adjusted the hexapods, so the beams of light converged in a single spot. These were not like any lasers Eli had ever seen. The light defied the laws of physics, or at least the more basic ones Eli understood. Where the beams met, the light seemed to spin apart, like sparks showering off a metal grinder, miniature fireworks. Eli took in a deep breath. The mist smelled of lavender and also tea tree oil. He joked. Between the humming of those things and that aromatherapy stuff, this place is turning into a yoga studio. Khan didn't even glance up from his adjustments. What's humming? Eli leaned over the hexapods. The sound was definitely emanating from them, and the sound was beautiful. So beautiful. It was like the song a blue sky would sing to the ocean, and underneath the prominent hum were more songs. The grass calling to butterflies, the moon crying over a broken heart, the sun fusing hydrogen atoms into helium while whistling. Watch your face, Khan warned, jolting Eli out of a daze. Eli pulled back and sat up straight. He held himself still, resisting the urge to get closer to the pods and their dancing light show. Pop quiz, Khan said. Do you know what a D6 is? Six-sided dice. Die, singular. Point for Eli. Khan tossed a D6 onto the coffee table and gestured for Eli to pick it up. Notice anything else?" Eli picked up the D6. Other than being made of metal, it resembled the dice that might be found in any copy of Monopoly, such as the mangled game box sitting not 5 feet away from them, next to the toy box. He looked more closely at the die. Something didn't feel right. The weight. Even if it were made of the lightest type of metal, the die should have weighed more than this. This die would float on water. "It's hollow," Eli guessed. Con nodded, seemingly pleased that Eli was using his senses to figure things out. Gold star on Eli's report card. Eli has really applied himself today. Con reached into the front of his shirt and pulled out a thin silver chain. Hanging on the chain were 2 rectangular pendants, like the dog tags soldiers wear. Between the tags was a smaller pendant in the shape of a key, but not a full-sized house key, more like a charm for a bracelet. Eli watched, fascinated, as Con pushed the key into one of the pips on the D6, then gave it a twist. He handed the cube back to Eli, who stared in amazement. The die was hollow, and now all the pips were holes. The inside of the die had a delicious smell, like every kind of delicious home baking rolled up into one aroma. Eli stared at the hollow die and got a very strange urge. He wanted to shrink down to a grain of salt and climb inside this wonderful contraption. He wanted to see the gears and sliding plates at work inside. "Careful." Con swiped the metal box from Eli's hands. "Don't drool on the thing or it'll snap shut. You're an unusual guy, Eli, but I still don't want your saliva for my trophy wall." He paused. "No offense." "None taken." Eli wiped his lower lip, horrified that he actually had been drooling. Con rolled the hollow metal cube across the coffee table, as though he was taking a turn in a game. It stopped in the center of the hexapods, directly underneath the sparking light. "The rest is obvious," Con said. "You hold the possessed object in the paralight, and bam! The poltergeist drops down into the D6. Once the element is inside there, the doors slam shut, and it's nighty-night time. Forever." "Forever?" A sadness gripped Eli. He felt bad for the poltergeists. Forever was a long time. Con leaned over, flicked the switches on the 6 hexapods, and shut the whole thing down. The beautiful humming music disappeared. Now the street noise of old cars driving by outside intruded upon the peaceful calm of the living room. Con used the key on his chain to close the D6 trap. He reached into one of his pockets and pulled out an identical die, which he tossed to Eli. This one was heavy, as if it were made of lead. "Heavy-duty trap?" Eli asked. "More like a soggy diaper." Con grinned. "You used to babysit, so you should be able to figure that one out." Soggy diaper? Eli pondered this as he rolled the die in his hand. He had babysat some infants in his teenage years. A used diaper was always heavy, because it was full. Eli gasped and dropped the heavy die on the coffee table. It rolled, but not like a regular D6. The metallic die rolled in a spiral until it came back around to Eli and stopped, the top side displaying 6 pips. "It likes you," Con said. Eli gave him a dirty look. "You said that about the plant, too. It's not good for supernatural stuff to like you, is it?" Con held up his hand for quiet and tipped his head. "Do you hear that scratching?" This wasn't one of Con's jokes. There was scratching, a skittering sound coming from the floor above them. Eli's first guess was that the raccoon he'd seen under the house, or her mate, had come inside the house. The skittering continued, punctuated by a thump. "That could be a raccoon," Eli said. "Right?" "Raccoons are nocturnal, and they don't skitter. That's definitely a skitter." The sound got even more skitter-like, removing any doubt it was a raccoon. The skitter seemed to be inviting them to come upstairs. Really, it had perfect timing. now that the hexapod's demonstration had been completed. "This feels like a trap," Eli said. "It sure does." Khan's eyebrows danced with excitement. The skittering kept going, getting quieter, and then louder, taunting them. "Definitely a trap," Eli said. Khan leapt to his feet and yelled up at the ceiling. "It's about time! Don't hold back, baby!" He looked down at Eli, his dark green eyes gleaming. "What do you think it is?" The thing in the kitchen was orange." "What's orange? Prison jumpsuits? Prisoners on death row? Oh, no!" As excited as he was that paranormal things were finally happening, the idea of encountering a murderer made Eli's crack flood with sweat. Khan was already running toward the stairs. Eli jumped to his feet and followed, because walking into a murderous ghost's trap together was better than being left out. Chapter 10. Khan and Eli climbed to the wooden staircase, moving toward the scratching sound. When they reached the top, Khan nodded for Eli to turn left. "You do a visual check of the bathroom." "Visual? Check it for what?" "Poltergeists, Eli." "Let's say I find one. What next? Call for you?" "No." "Then I don't understand. In horror movies, bad things happen when the people split up and go separate directions. I should go with you." "Then you'll never develop your skills." The skittering had stopped, almost as though the paranormal entity were standing there, listening to them argue. "Fine," Eli said reluctantly. "I'll go look on my own. But if I do see something, what next?" "Look at me. Can you do this?" Khan widened his eyes and stared at Eli with a very watchful expression. The stare was so intense, Eli had to look down at his socked feet for a moment. When he looked back up, Khan was still staring, his dark green eyes wide and recriminating. Eli couldn't take it anymore and said, "Stop staring! You're creeping me out more than the ghosts." Khan kept staring, not blinking. His eyes were watering now, and still he didn't blink or look away. Eli made a guess. "I'm supposed to stare at the ghost?" Khan's dark eyebrows lifted, ever so slightly, encouraging Eli to keep going. "I stare at the ghost and make it feel awkward. Then I wait for it to hide inside an object. I check the temperature of the object with my hands. Then we put it on the hexapod doohickeys and zap zap." Khan blinked and softened his expression. "That's exactly what you do." Then he turned to the right and went down the hall toward the first door. Eli felt so happy for himself for figuring out the plan of action. He forgot to feel nervous as he entered the potentially haunted bathroom. A shower curtain was drawn across the interior of a restored clawfoot tub. Eli walked right up to the curtain and whipped it open in one sweep. No ghost. With his eyes wide open and ready, he yanked open cupboard doors and checked inside all the cabinets and in the drawers. He found spare toilet paper, bath toys, and waterproof picture books. He paused in thought. Waterproof picture books were a thing? Would wonders never cease? He turned around, faced the toilet, and carefully lifted the padded toilet seat. He wanted to find the ghost, but not here. Please, no, not here. If poltergeists hid inside toilets, he didn't know what he would do. Surely there were some boundaries, like the secret gangster code that criminals follow, and ghosts respected the sanctity of toilets. Haunting churches would be fine, but please, not the toilets. Eli held his breath and gave it a test flush. No ghost. He checked behind the shower curtain again, felt all the objects on the counter, then left the bathroom. He could hear Khan talking in the other room, but figured he was just talking to himself. Eli moved on to the next room, a home office. There was a computer desk, a set of golf clubs, and a stack of cardboard filing boxes. He stood at the doorway and took a calming breath. So far, so good. Eli's sweat glands had calmed down. His skin felt sticky, and he needed a shower, but his state of mind felt good. The fear had made him alert, and he liked this feeling. It was the same feeling he got playing video games. Some people would call it engaged. Eli thought of this state of mind as not bored. He enjoyed being not bored. Bring on the poltergeists, Eli thought. He crept around the home office, eyes wide, whipping his head from side to side at the slightest hint of a sound. He felt himself smiling. Hunting for ghosts was like playing hide and seek. Eli had been an only child, but the younger kids in his apartment building had been happy to play with him. They also appreciated the fact he didn't lie to them, like most adults did. Eli was the guy everyone went to for the truth about Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. Now that Eli was whipping open closet doors looking for poltergeists, he thought of the times he assured little kids there were no monsters under their beds or in their closets. He could never say that now. If a child asked him, he'd have to say he had his own monster under his bed, and its name was Monty. Eli finished the visual inspection of the office and then let his intuition guide him. He stretched his arms out and touched various objects at random, feeling for temperature shifts. Nothing struck him as odd. From behind him, someone whispered, "I'm watching you." Eli replied to who he thought was Khan. "How am I doing?" "You're terrible at this. You both are." "Both?" Eli whipped around, eyes wide. Something bright orange flashed like a supernova. Eli's eyelids clamped shut in reflex. When he opened them again, he had blue and purple splotches across his vision. He tried to chase the splotches down, but they were like floaters, inside his eyes, and not out in the world. Eli's heart was racing, but he was still smiling, engaged, not bored. He was getting warmer. If there was one thing he'd learned from video games, it was that enemies popped up when you were on the right track. He went into the next room, which was a little kid's room. He guessed the room belonged to a boy because it wasn't entirely pink and purple, but he did keep an open mind because not every little girl loves purple. With all his senses on high alert, he looked high and low, triple-checking the closet and the space under the bed. No ghost. No whispering voice telling him he sucked either. "Show yourself," Eli said to the quiet room. The room seemed to get even more quiet, the kind of absence of noise that makes your ears ring. Eli breathed in deeply. The air had a new scent, ozone, like the edge of the ocean. More boldly, Eli repeated his words. "Show yourself!" The air seemed to thicken around him like a breathable gel. A breathable gel. Something that felt like a warm wave of water moved up Eli's back and slid over him like a blanket. He remembered something that was his own memory, a memory from the time before his life began, before he was found wandering the ruins of the zone. He was in that thick air, that breathable gel. He grew and he lived without living, and he watched. People talked around him, their words like shapes, triangles and squares. They opened their mouths and geometry came out, only it was just code. Code Eli didn't understand yet. Eli slithered into this memory. He slid down, down, down. He heard a thump. Chapter 11. Eli opened his eyes. He was looking up at a face he didn't recognize as a face, much less a specific person. The face was geometry, points and lines on a plane, light and shadows. "Fainting is better than vomiting," the face said. Eli's throat was dry. With a scratchy voice, he replied, "Anything's better than vomiting." The face looked concerned. It was Khan. He was the one with white hair and black eyebrows. Khan was his friend. These thoughts came to Eli as though being fed to him by someone else. Everything was wrong now. He used his elbows to push himself up to a sitting position. He looked around the child's bedroom in alarm. "Con? Why were you taking a floor nap? You fainted, right? Did you hit your head when you went down?" Eli rubbed the back of his head. There was a tender spot right on the back of his skull. "Well, that's helpful," Eli mused. "When you fall down and hit your head, you get a bump and a sore spot. That way, when someone asks you if you hit your head, you can tell them you did." He rubbed the spot some more. "Isn't the body a marvelous thing?" Con didn't seem as amazed. "We're calling it a day." "But we haven't caught the ghost yet. Unless you did already. How long was I out?" "I don't know. After you said those arrogant things to me, I had to get outside for a walk. I figured it was better for me to blow off some steam than to punch you in the face on your first day." Eli noticed that Con's breath smelled like beer. He also noticed that the sun had gone down outside, and the child's bedroom was now lit by a ceiling light. "You left me here alone?" Eli asked. "Not entirely alone. There was a squirrel. That was the scratching we heard." Con sounded terse as he explained the situation. He seemed angry at Eli, like the bad mood was growing now that he wasn't as worried about Eli being hurt. "I left the window open, and the squirrel seems to be gone now. Problem solved, case closed." Eli's insides felt scrambled with emotions. He couldn't bear Con being upset at him, and he felt bad about whatever he'd done. Sure, he'd questioned Con's methods, but he hadn't been arrogant. He started to apologize for the umpteenth time that day, but stopped. Why should he apologize? Now Eli was feeling abused, and rightly so. Con had left him, passed out in a pile of drool, alone with a ghost and a squirrel. "You left me alone with a squirrel? What if it had been rabid? I could have been bitten." "You should have thought of that before you said what you did." What had Eli said? They'd come upstairs, and he'd gone to search the rooms on one side of the house. Everything had been fine. Until... Con! It was the ghost! I heard it too. He came to the doorway behind me and whispered that he was watching me, and that I was terrible at this job. Con hiccuped and staggered back. He slurred. "That's what you said. Don't you tell me what you said to me, because I know. You said I was good for nothing, worthless." "So you went for a drink?" "It's what I do best." By the way, Con grabbed onto the edge of the client's dresser. Eli could tell he had no small amount of alcohol running through his veins. Eli glanced around the room. It wasn't safe to talk here. He didn't know if it was safe to talk anywhere, but right here seemed like the worst place to plan their next steps. "Con, it was a trap," Eli said. "Life's a trap." "Let's go, then." Eli got himself standing. His legs were shaky, but he was doing better than Con, who was now muttering incoherently about people blaming things on ghosts. He continued muttering and began launching karate kicks into the air around him. Eli received a few drunken kicks in the legs before he got Con calmed down and back downstairs. The client still hadn't returned home, but Eli didn't want to be there with his drunk boss when he did. He gathered up the sensors and other equipment, returned the spare key, and dragged Con back out to the van. It was dark outside, and even though it was a spring evening, the air had a chill that reminded Eli of Halloween. Naturally, Con thought he should drive. At least he'd walked himself to and from the nearby pub while Eli had been passed out, so the van was still parked where they'd left it, and didn't have any street signs or people embedded in the grill. After a brief scuffle inside the vehicle, Eli got Con belted into the passenger seat and began to drive away from the house. Eli glanced over his shoulder at the old house. They'd turned off all the lights on their way out, but now the windows were glowing orange, taunting him. Eli clenched his hands around the steering wheel. That ghost was really getting on his nerves. It could try and scare him all it wanted, because that only seemed sporting. But this business of coming between him and Con, trying to destroy their budding friendship, that was not okay. Whatever it took, Eli vowed to stop at nothing. By whatever means necessary, he was going to get that evil spirit into the smallest D6 cage available. Chapter 12. On the drive home, Con tried to get Eli to visit a strip club with him. Eli politely refused. Oh, he wanted to go and enjoy some beer, nudity, and male bonding, but not like this. Not with Con drunk and surly before they even walked in the door. Con seemed ready to pick a fight, and being around someone like that was a surefire way to get punched in the face. "You're going home to sleep it off," Eli said. "It's a school night. Now give me your home address." Being drunk and surly, Con refused. "I live at the North Pole," he said. "Come on, we just go to one club. It's not even a big one. We've got to support the city's stripper economy. Come on, Eli, do a good deed." "It's almost my bedtime." Con howled with laughter, thinking Eli had been joking about having a bedtime. He was not. Eli drove toward the storefront, figuring he'd be able to track down Valentine and get her to help, or dump Con there. They were still 10 minutes away from the shop when Con turned to Eli and slurred, "Promise you won't touch the stuff? I'm serious." "Your equipment?" The bags sat on the floor of the van between their bucket seats. "Not one finger." "I wasn't planning to touch it. Why?" Instead of answering, Con flung the door open as they passed a strip club. "See you later, sucker!" Eli slammed the brakes and ground the van to a halt just as Con snapped off the seatbelt and jumped out in one fluid motion. He ran crookedly to the door of the club and disappeared. Eli got home just after 9 o'clock, which actually wasn't as late as it had felt when he was driving home. He found Brenda on the couch, watching TV while reading a magazine and texting on her phone. He cast a suspicious look at the brown recliner, then knelt on the floor before her and rested his head in her lap. She ran her fingers through his hair. "How was your first day?" she asked, brightly. "Is my Eli tired?" "Tired? Do you want to tell me all about how it went?" "No." She sighed. It wasn't clear if she was sighing out of sympathetic disappointment for him, or because trying to get details about his day was always so taxing. A quiet moment passed with only the rabble of a singing contest on the television. She prompted, "Did you catch a ghost?" "No." He pressed his face into her jeans. After a long day in unfamiliar surroundings, the scent of the fabric softener they used was as soothing as Brenda's fingertips on his scalp. "If you didn't catch a ghost, what did you do all day? He'd better be paying you overtime." Eli kept his mouth shut. He didn't want to tell Brenda he'd slept for a few hours, thanks to fainting. And what was that fainting business all about anyway? Except for the times he'd been strangled by the cat wraith, Eli had never fainted before, and that was a shame, because he'd certainly been in plenty of embarrassing situations where he'd hoped for sudden unconsciousness. Eli retraced his steps. There'd been a voice at the door, and then Eli had challenged the ghost to show itself. Then the air in the room had gone funny. Perhaps the ghost had drained out the oxygen, or put in some other gas. Several theories sprung to mind, but none was a perfect fit. Brenda kept rubbing his scalp, smoothing out his thoughts. She was so good at calming him. She excelled at making him irate and also calming him. She gave up on getting details from him and turned up the volume on the show. With his head still in her lap, Eli said, "I'd rather tell you about my day when I've got something good to share." I know. A moment passed. Eli asked, "Well, how was your day?" She put the TV show on pause. "You know Rachel, the one with the mole, the one who thinks people can't tell she's got some tragic eating disorder, always cooking those sweet potatoes in the microwave? I think she's trying to get with Jeffrey, even though he's barely separated from his wife. And everyone knows you have to wait at least a year. And Carol told me that she saw an email Rachel sent to Roscoe after the whole printer toner incident. And as Brenda explained the drama from the first half of the day, Eli closed his eyes. To his surprise, Brenda's words stopped being words. All he had to do was lean his mind a little to one side, and her words became abstract, notes in a song. He leaned a little in the other direction. The notes turned into shapes, triangles and circles, lines and dots. That was different. He connected this new experience with the memory that had come to him after he bumped his head. The memory was weak, though, and when he looked harder, he tripped across memories from Donnie. Now he was overcome with sadness over the death of Donnie's girlfriend by overdose. He had been doing chest compressions for no more than 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. He'd felt her rib crack. He kept going. Eli's mind flooded with grief. Life was so full of disappointments. He gritted his teeth and clenched his jaw. Brenda was still talking. The triangles turned back into words. I know, right? One of these days she's going to get fired for not doing her job. I don't care what she does with her free time, but a person needs to do her job. Just think about how much better the world would be if every single person just did what they were supposed to do. Eli pulled his face out of Brenda's lap, sat up straight, and looked into her eyes. She seemed surprised to see him there. You're right, he said. I need to do my job. Starting tomorrow, no more goofing around. I won't let my mind wander. I will catch that poltergeist. Her eyes widened, the thick fringe of mascara-coated eyelashes rising dramatically. Poltergeist? That sounds fun. If I can get a ride, I'm going to come see you at lunchtime. Will you be at the store or on location somewhere? That's a bad idea. Her nostrils flared. Don't you get a lunch break? You should get a lunch break, and a dinner break, too, if they're working you overtime. Brenda. He shook his head. She broke eye contact and pretended to be intensely interested in the TV show. We can talk about it next week, he said. But it was too late for compromise. She refused to look at him, which meant the silent treatment was in effect. He got up and went to rummage in the fridge for a late dinner. He had no appetite, but he needed to keep his energy up for tomorrow. He ate leftover dead cow loaf standing over the sink, and then went to the bedroom with his laptop. They didn't have a desk in the small apartment, so he propped up pillows for his back and sat cross-legged on the bed. He fired up the laptop and started with the search request he'd been thinking of most of the day. How to catch a poltergeist. The results were not as helpful as he'd hoped. He mostly found spec scripts by aspiring screenwriters. He did find one interesting webcomic and lost himself for a while reading the archives, which had very little to do with catching poltergeists, but were quite funny. After reading all the webcomic archives, he did more searches on poltergeists, getting nowhere. Bedtime was approaching. A yowling sound from the alley below startled Eli. He turned to face the dark window and listened. More yowling. It sounded like a few cats. Eli turned back to the laptop and did a search for cat wraiths. He found nothing that matched what he knew about the entity that had allegedly told Brenda his name was Monty. He did find an ancient Egyptian cat god named Montsumachu, who decided the fate of entire villages based on its whims. The cat god sounded like a real psycho. The artist's rendering of Montsumachu ripping out beating hearts was not the kind of thing one should look at before bedtime. Eli bookmarked the page. He had only 5 minutes until bedtime. Brenda was already brushing her teeth. Last-minute inspiration struck, and he did a search for the manufacturer of the ray gun. Eli queried, Azure, manufacturer, ray gun, number 112. He hit the search button, and the screen went white, hanging. He waited 20 seconds, then clicked the refresh button. Still nothing but a white screen. He opened the other browser installed on the laptop and repeated the search. The computer whirred noisily. Ouch! He lifted the laptop from his thighs. The machine was overheating, burning him. The fan must have stopped working, or something else was overclocking the CPU. He held the laptop up to his mouth and blew into the vents like he was playing the harmonica. All this accomplished was putting an acrid taste in his mouth. He did a hard reboot and tried to search a third time. Azure, manufacturer, ray gun, number 112. The white screen came up, only this time it was accompanied by a dialog box, black with a green blinking cursor. The prompt read, Enter username. Eli looked around the bedroom. The back of his head tickled, the way it had back at the poltergeist house before the orange thing had flashed by. He looked at the dialog box again, and he typed in Anonymous. He pressed the return key. The screen flashed red, and the speakers began to emit a mind-shattering squeal. Eli clapped his hands over his ears. How was this possible? The speakers had stopped working a year ago, and now they were louder than the apartment's smoke detector. Brenda came running in with her hands over her ears. Eli used his elbows to close the laptop. The sound wouldn't stop, and now the computer was hotter than ever, burning his thighs. He flipped it off his lap and covered it with a pillow. The squealing was still loud, but now he could remove his hands from his ears. He tossed a second pillow on top of the first, and then threw his body over the top of everything. Brenda yelled, "Stop it right now! You'll have the whole building at our door in a minute!" "It's malfunctioning! I didn't do this on purpose! Make it stop!" The squealing wasn't so loud, muffled between the mattress, two pillows, and Eli's stomach. "It should tire itself out in a few minutes," Eli said. "The battery should run out." The squealing pitched higher, but fainter. "See?" Brenda narrowed her eyes. "What were you looking at on our laptop, Eli?" She didn't say it, but he knew she was referring to the pin-up girl incident from 2 months ago. "Did you install something on the laptop?" he asked. "Should I have?" The squealing laptop under him now sounded sad and pathetic, dying. "Brenda, what did you do?" She crossed her arms. "I don't know, Eli. What did you do? Were you making donations to good causes again? We don't need any more calendars." "It was only $20, and it really was for a good cause." She pressed the remote control to control the curtains. "Bedtime." The laptop emitted one final gasping squeal, then went silent. Eli rolled to the side and pulled off the pillows. A burning smell wafted up and made him cough. He had a bad feeling the laptop wasn't going to boot up again. The possible death of his only computer would have ordinarily ruined Eli's night, but he wasn't without hope. There was a chance Valentine might be able to fix the laptop. And tomorrow was another day. He put the laptop away and got ready for bed. As he brushed his teeth, he thought over what he knew about hackers, real hackers, who did stuff over the internet. He didn't know much, really, but he knew what spyware was, and that information went around in packets, and certain software sniffed around for good packets. It was possible someone had detected him searching for Azure and decided to shut that down. But why? If you were trying to hide top-secret information, the best way to do that would be to bury it in misinformation, or quietly scour every trace of it online. The stupidest thing to do would be to alert the casual internet user that they were on to something. Therefore, if that dialogue window was the work of a hacker, the hacker actually wanted Eli to keep searching for Azure. Reverse psychology. Eventually, they would let him find some trail of breadcrumbs that would lead him directly to them. He'd walk right into their trap, and they'd use mind control stuff on him and turn him into a terrorist and set him up for some cybercrime. Eli's electric toothbrush stopped its timed run. He rinsed out his mouth, feeling pretty pleased with himself that he'd figured out some hacker organization's entire devious plan in the time it took him to brush his teeth. Nice try, stupid hackers. He climbed into bed with a smile on his face. He had a good mind when he applied himself, and first thing tomorrow, he was going to figure out how to catch that poltergeist, or both of them, if there really were two. He could hardly sleep, he was so excited. Because of this excitement, instead of the usual 60 seconds it took Eli to fall asleep, he lay awake for nearly 15 15 minutes. Meanwhile, in a bunker deep below the surface of the earth, a computer printed out a new filing label. Eli Carter. Threat level yellow. Chapter 13. Things were going smoothly enough on Tuesday morning, until Eli and Brenda got down to the van and found the passenger side window smashed. Eli let out a steady stream of expletives as he checked to see what else had been damaged or stolen. The stale granola bars from the glove box were gone, as was the parking meter change Eli kept in the ashtray. At least Khan's bags of gear were still there, right where Eli had stupidly left them overnight. He should have brought the stuff up to the apartment, but Khan had told him not to touch the stuff, and Eli had felt just belligerent enough to take the order literally. Brenda helped him clean up the pebbles of broken safety glass, and they continued on their way. She would typically be more upset about this type of thing, but this morning she had an aura of calm, as though she was above such petty worries. Even her chin seemed to tilt up higher than usual. They'd been driving for 10 minutes when she reached for one of the camouflage print bags. "Khan didn't want me to touch the equipment," Eli said. She unzipped it anyway. Eli gave her a dirty look, and she responded with, "He didn't say anything about me not touching it, did he?" Eli admitted this was true. She held up one of the objects. "What's this?" "A hexapod." "Hmm?" She dug around in the bag. "Shouldn't it be called a pentapod if there are only 5 of them?" Eli's heart sunk into darkness, faster than the sun in the time-lapse opening of a nature film about bats. The thieves had taken his granola bars, parking change, and an integral piece of high-tech equipment, the replacement cost of which he couldn't begin to imagine. He explained this to Brenda, who helped him look through the bags and then search the interior of the van while he kept driving. Eli's heart stayed down. One of the hexapods was definitely gone. "I'm sure you'll figure out something clever," Brenda said calmly. Eli eyed her suspiciously. Why wasn't she freaking out, or at least driving home the point that she'd already told him on multiple occasions to empty the glove box and leave it open whenever he parked in the underground parking spot? Had the thieves also snatched Brenda during the night and replaced her with a pod person? He kept stealing glances over at her. Something about her face wasn't right. Chapter 14. Brenda sat in her usual seat in the van while Eli drove toward the delivery depot. She was going to her usual job, but she wasn't feeling the usual Tuesday morning feelings. The vehicle break-in bothered her more than she was letting on. She flicked a stray pebble of safety glass out the open window. The broken glass was a metaphor for her life, she decided. Just when she had everything organized, with the two of them in a comfortable groove, along came this exciting new job for Eli. At first, she'd been hopeful, but then the fears and doubts of all her co-workers had infected her. She couldn't tell everyone Eli was working as a ghost exterminator. As far as her co-workers knew, Eli was delivering for an appliance repair shop. They couldn't understand why he'd taken a step down. Her co-worker, Jeffrey, kept popping his head up over the cubicle, asking questions. Had Eli taken an interest in losing weight or working out? Jeffrey said that was a sign Eli was cheating on her. Changes were bad for couples, according to Jeffrey. The van rattled over train tracks. Brenda pulled out her phone and sent a text to Rachel, complaining about Jeffrey trying to look down everyone's shirts while giving bad relationship advice. Rachel replied by sending photos of people on the bus with her, along with her critique about their appearances. Brenda put her phone away because the negativity was increasing her sense of impending doom. Why did she feel so awful? She'd taken her supplements. What Brenda didn't realize, thanks to the chaos of the van break-in, was that Eli's job wasn't the only change in their lives. The night before, Brenda had slept with an ancient Egyptian god curled up at her feet. It was the second time, and that's the sort of new routine that's going to make a person feel a little weird in the morning. And she did feel weird. Very weird. "I don't know how late I'll have to work," Eli said. Brenda pressed her lips together tightly and kept looking out the window. She worried about him spending so much time with this guy, Khan, a necromancer. It was bad enough they lived in a city with crashers running amok, eating each other and falling down buildings and doing heaven knows what to survive. What Eli and Brenda really needed to do was build up enough of a nest egg so they could move somewhere better, to a city that wasn't the sinkhole of the country, sucking evil towards itself like some dank, dark pit that led straight to "Babe?" Eli stopped the hamster wheel of darkness in her head, the way he always did. "Ride? After work?" "I can get a lift home easy enough," she said, lightly. "What's wrong? You sound worried." "Don't be ridiculous," she snapped. "I'm a grown-up. I can take the bus if I need to." "Okie dokie, Smokey." Eli nodded and kept driving, with his typical worry-free expression on his face. She envied him his calm and his ability to take a nap anywhere. It was only natural that she was worried, Brenda told herself. Eli was everything to her, the only person who made life good. She had created a life for herself in this sinkhole of a city, but that was just for show. None of it would mean anything without Eli. There were things he did that drove her crazy, but, as they both joked, it wasn't a long drive to Brenda's crazy town. You could get there by foot. She tried to cut him some slack, but it was hard. Being easygoing wasn't her nature. Sometimes she opened the secret cabinet behind the bathroom mirror and took out the engagement ring Eli kept hidden away in there. It was such a beautiful ring, and she wanted it so badly that she just had to occasionally kick him in the kidneys. She knew it was wrong of her, but it was wrong of him first, and two wrongs was the theme of their relationship. Two wrongs that go together all right. On Saturday night, when he called late and said he was crashing at some farmhouse way out in the countryside, she didn't think much of it. She stayed over at friends' houses all the time. Always girlfriends, of course, because Eli was the only man she trusted on her side of a locked door when she was sleeping. Eli never stayed over elsewhere, though. All night long she suffered nightmares that he'd died, that this was her life now, without him. The night had been the longest one of her life, and she'd had some long nights in her 26 years on the planet. She couldn't tell Eli about her fears. He'd think she was even more screwed up than his initial assessment. So she did what she could. She bought dead cow and stuck her hands in the meaty bits, squishing in the breadcrumbs and ketchup, just like the recipe said. If dead cow was the way to Eli's heart, she would squish it through her fingers every day. This new job of his wouldn't last long. Eli had started a half-dozen things in the last year alone, from learning to play bass guitar to taking entrepreneurial classes by correspondence. He'd never finished any of the classes, and he certainly couldn't play bass guitar. Eli took a hard right turn, and the van rattled up to the staff entrance for the delivery depot. He grinned over at her, looking more handsome than ever. He always looked extra cute when she thought critically about him, which made her feel awful. He said, "Don't tell the gang in the office I missed them, because I don't." "Okay. Catch some big ghosts today." "Can't make any promises." He gave her a grin, so charming it nearly broke her heart. Chapter 15. Eli parked the van at the office staff's entrance and leaned over to kiss Brenda goodbye. Up close to her face, he realized her eye makeup was different. Her mascara application had been scaled back to only a few coats, and her eyes were rimmed with dark crayon, cat-like. She noticed him staring at her and smiled sweetly. He kissed her again, drawn in by her charm. He would have kept kissing her, too, but someone rapped on the driver's side window. It was the grizzled warehouse foreman. Eli rolled the window down and greeted him.
"Got something for you, young feller."
The man cleared his throat and spat on the ground via the gap in his front teeth. "I don't work here anymore," Eli replied.
"You don't, huh?"
Eli smiled. He was still worried about the missing hexapod, but had just realized how good those 5 words felt, put together in that order. I don't work here anymore. Such a beautiful phrase. The foreman thrust his meaty fist through Eli's open window. He held a silver hand tool.
"Present for you," he said. "This is for scraping the company decal off the side of your van. Go slow so you don't scratch the paint."
Eli thanked him and took the tool. The man spat again and went on his way. Brenda had already jumped out and was on her way to the admin office. Alone in the van, Eli looked down at the silver scraping tool. Its retractable blade was covered in sticky goo. Did he really want to scrape off the decal already? It had cost Eli a good chunk of money to get the delivery company's decal put on the side of the van. If something were to happen, and Eli needed his old job back, he didn't want to pay for the decal application a second time. He tossed the tool in the glove box and continued on his way to Ghost Hackers. The storefront was dark, but the door opened. Eli walked back and found Valentine in the workshop. She wore the same red hoodie and jeans as the day before, giving him the impression she'd never left. He let his footfalls be heavy so he didn't startle her. "I have bad news, and more bad news," Eli said. Her ponytail flicked to acknowledge his presence. He set down the bags of gear he'd brought in. With the van's broken window, he didn't dare leave the stuff behind again. Valentine didn't look up from her circuit board. "I already heard all about yesterday." She leaned forward and adjusted a magnifying lens on a swing arm. "He really shouldn't drink like that, because of his heart condition." Eli completely misinterpreted what Valentine said and began to laugh. "A good one. Heart condition," he said, referencing the siblings' shared last name. She turned and gave him a perplexed look. Eli realized she hadn't been making a pun after all, and tried to explain his misinterpretation and that he wasn't a monster for laughing. However, as with trying to convince someone you're not crazy, the very fact the situation has come up guarantees you can't succeed. He gave up and moved on to the worst of the bad news. His van had been broken into. A hexapod was gone, and he was very sorry. "Take it off my pay," he offered. "Forget about the hexapod," she said neutrally. "I have some new gear in beta testing that's—" She paused. "Safe and effective?" "Effective," she finished. The way she omitted the word safe gave Eli some concern. Valentine rolled her chair back and dismounted, then nodded for Eli to follow her over to a wall of flat panel screens. She tapped away at a keyboard, and the screens all lit up. She pointed to one screen, which showed Khan in a bed, rolling around in a fitful state. "Is he okay?" Eli asked. "Is he taking the day off?" "His heart works better when he gets a full 8 hours. I'll wake him up now." She tapped away at the keyboard. Khan immediately jumped out of the bed and disappeared off the edge of the screen. Valentine explained, "The wake-up alarm plays bagpipes in the other room. He hates bagpipes." "That's a good trick." "The apartment's just up there." She pointed to the ceiling. "He'll be down shortly." She glanced at the other video screens. "You're getting a parking ticket." Eli followed her gaze to the monitor that showed a parking enforcer leaning over to get his van's plate number. He took off running. Outside, he gasped to the woman, "Have mercy!" The parking enforcer was a woman of about 50, with gray hair coiled up in tight curls. She was the same one who'd given him a ticket the week before, outside the zone. "My middle name is Mercy," she said. "Go ahead and plead your case." "Are you serious? You really want to hear about my problems?" "Son, do I look like a bartender? Don't tell me your problems. Tell me why I shouldn't give you a ticket." "See how I've broken my window? My van got busted into last night, and they took some valuable equipment I need for my job. Plus, they took all my parking change." "Did you keep the change in the ashtray? You shouldn't do that. Very stupid." Eli hung his head. "I know. I'm going to write you 2 tickets, one for the parking and one for that pathetic attempt at swaying my feelings." She made a tisk-tisk sound. "I think you can do better. Let's go double or nothing. Dig deeper." Eli looked up into the woman's steely eyes. "Dig deeper," she repeated. "Have mercy," he said slowly, "because last week I had a safe job and an ordinary life, and now I'm throwing it all away. I've been strangled, drowned, and suffocated. I don't know what's happening from one minute to the next, and I think I like it." The woman rubbed her chin thoughtfully. She glanced over at the logo on the side of the van. "You used to work for them?" she asked. Eli nodded. "Up until yesterday." "They're a good company," she said. "I used them to take care of my family business before I left everything and moved out of Castle Point to start fresh. I used their rush courier service to smuggle my husband's rare tropical birds back to the rainforest they'd been captured from. And do you know why?" "Because you're a crazy old lady?" She laughed at this. "I like you, kid. I sent them away because a caged bird's got nothing to sing about." She put away her ticket dispenser without issuing a ticket. Before Eli could thank her, she hopped on her bike and rode away, whistling. Eli stared after her for a moment, and then he grabbed the scraping tool from the glove box and began removing the van's decal. Eli Carter was no parakeet. Chapter 16. Eli was still scraping the decal off the van when the front door to Ghost Hackers opened, and the store coughed up Con like a cat with a hairball.
"Morning,"
Con grumbled as he staggered to a stop. He had more heavy-looking bags of gear strapped over each shoulder and dark sunglasses over his eyes. "Good morning," Eli replied. 5 more minutes. I'm almost done." He turned back to scraping the decal off the side of the delivery van. It had been tricky to find the optimum angle for scraping. The edges of the decal were brittle and cracked, but the inner area was sticky and required the perfect amount of pressure. Not too fast and not too... Con yanked the silver scraper from Eli's hand.
"Give it a rest."
"But I'm almost done."
"So?"
Eli looked at the remaining portion of the decal. He couldn't leave it like that. He went at the job with his fingernails, picking away desperately. He could see Con at the edge of his vision, shifting from side to side with impatience. A brittle edge of the decal snapped off and cut him under his fingernail. 5 more minutes, Eli begged. Con handed Eli back the scraper and went to wait inside the van, in the passenger seat. Once Eli had removed the entire decal, he smiled with satisfaction. Then he hurriedly got into the van and started the engine. He asked Con if Valentine told him about the stolen hexapod.
"Yep."
Con pulled a spiral notebook from one of the bags and started writing on a page.
"Do you know where the Bolorama is?" "Of course you do. It's a landmark. Well, what are you waiting for?"
The engine was running, but Eli hadn't pulled out onto the road yet. The Bolorama was in the opposite direction of the Purple House. Eli asked, "Are we picking something up there before we go back to the poltergeist house?"
"Maybe we're going bowling."
Eli tapped his fingers on the steering wheel for a moment. He was confused, but at least nobody seemed that upset about the stolen hexapod. He pulled the van onto the street and drove toward the Bolorama. Con wasn't in the mood for chatting or explaining. They were 6 minutes away from the bowling alley when the silence was broken by Eli's phone ringing. He pulled out the phone and looked for a break in traffic so he could pull over. Eli would have tossed the phone to Con, but Con appeared to be asleep. Eli answered the phone with a hesitant hello.
"Are you two chuckleheads coming to finish the job you started?"
"Just one moment, sir." Eli dropped the phone between his thighs and leaned over to shake Con by the shoulder to wake him up. "It's the client from the Purple House."
"And?"
"We called us chuckleheads."
"Both of us?"
Con scowled. "Do you want to talk to him or not?" Con scoffed and sunk down in the passenger seat, resting one boot on the dashboard. Eli pulled the phone up to his ear. "Sir, my boss is offended you called us chuckleheads."
"I ought to call the police on you is what I should do. You made a mess in the kitchen, a mess upstairs, and what happened to the seedlings?"
"You wouldn't believe me if I told you." Eli finally caught a break in the traffic and pulled over to the side to continue the call safely. "Sir, we've had some setbacks with our equipment. Plus, I'm new at this. Would you like us to come back over today? There's a whole questionnaire I'd like to go through with you." There was a howling, paranormal sound on the other side of the line. Eli held his breath, eyes wide as he listened. The sound had to be the ghost tormenting the homeowner. "Sir, are you still there? Hello?" Through the howling, Eli could just barely make out the client yelling for them to get over to the house and finish the job. The call went quiet. The phone screen was blank, the battery suddenly dead. Eli thought of his poor dead laptop back at the apartment and wondered if this was also the work of hackers.
"So much for bowling," Con said. "That sounded urgent. Maybe I should drive."
"I don't think so." Eli checked all the lanes and made an illegal yet relatively safe U-turn. He tapped on the steering wheel excitedly. As he drove toward the client's house, he thought about another guy who'd been a delivery driver, like him. After a year, he quit and became an EMT, driving an ambulance. The guy would drop by the depot sometimes to have donuts in the break room and talk to the guys. He'd usually get called away by an accident, and the more horrible the accident sounded, the more excited he'd be. Eli had found the guy's interests macabre then, but not so much now. As Eli sped toward the client's house, adrenaline pumping, he hoped the ghost was doing something truly terrifying. Nobody came to the door when they knocked. Con pressed the buzzer repeatedly, then turned to Eli.
"Are you absolutely sure this is the address?"
"No, but this has to be the address, because if it isn't, we broke and entered yesterday."
"I like your logic."
Con tried the door handle. It was locked. He squatted down and flipped up the welcome mat. This time there was no key. Con grumbled.
"This is a setup, and I know who's behind it."
"What? Who?"
"Clearly it's a ploy by that bar down the street, Vinny's, to sell me a subpar beer that tastes of the soap they use to clean the lines."
"Huh?
"The bar?"
He straightened up and stretched.
"Good idea, Eli. Let's go get some refreshments so it's not a wasted trip."
Eli heard movement on the other side of the door. He knocked again. "Hello! It's us! We're back again!" He pressed his ear to the door and heard nothing.
"Figures," Con growled. "Waste of time."
"Who would try to waste our time like this? Do you have any enemies?"
"What do you think?"
Eli glanced around for signs of surveillance. His eyes widened when he spotted the unmarked van in front of the house. He jumped to a conclusion, then jumped back again once he realized it was actually just his van with the decal scraped off.
"We need to screen clients better,"
Con said. Eli was still jumpy and looking around for surveillance. "Could it be hackers? Like real ones? I was doing some research last night, and when I tried to look up that Azure company, something unusual happened to my computer. Now, it's possible my girlfriend installed something to restrict my access to photos of pinup girls, but it's also possible someone's trying to recruit me for a terrorist organization." Con pulled off his sunglasses dramatically.
Eli, why didn't you mention this sooner? Tell me everything, right now. These pin-up girls, are they wearing garter belts?
Eli frowned.
My laptop got really hot and made an awful noise. I have a bad feeling it's fried.
He groaned.
And I bet my phone is fried now, too. Did you print out any of the pin-up photos first?
Eli heard more movement behind the door. He held up one hand for silence.
Did you hear that?
The sound got louder and more distinct. It wasn't just movement. It was someone pleading for help, seemingly from inside the house. They both jumped into action, banging on the door and yelling to be let in. The cries for help got louder. Whatever was happening to the homeowner from the sound of his desperate cries, he wasn't able to let them in the door. Eli flew down the porch steps. Con yelled,
"Good idea! You go that way. I'll go this way and check the back for another entrance." "Wait!"
Eli picked up a rock from the garden and chucked it through the living room window. The glass shattered and fell away, leaving a green curtain of plants, the jungle they'd created the day before. Eli jumped up into the window frame and fought his way through the vines, Con hot on his heels. Inside the living room, they both paused to look and listen. There were no visible apparitions, but movement noises were coming from the upper floor. Con removed his sunglasses.
"Open the front door and grab the equipment bags, then follow me upstairs."
Eli did as he was told, then flew up the stairs, ready for an exciting encounter with a ghost. On the second floor, he tore down the hallway. There was nobody in the bathroom, so he moved on to the next room. He nearly ran into Con, who was standing just inside the door of the owner's home office. Con had his back to the hallway and his hands in the air. Eli didn't know what was happening, but he did see the glint of the ray gun tucked in the back of Con's waistband. He grabbed the petite gun, pointed it into the room, and yelled for everyone to freeze. This was Eli's moment. He yelled again for everyone to freeze, and he used some of the same words Samuel L. Jackson might use in a Quentin Tarantino movie. Chapter 17. In the seconds of silence following his profanity, Eli came to an uncomfortable realization. There was a menacing figure in front of Con, making him hold up his hands, but the figure didn't have any of the qualities you'd expect in a ghost. It looked just like a regular man who'd been woken by someone banging on his front door, like a regular guy who'd quickly pulled on a pair of jeans to check the door. Eli, however, was not born yesterday. Appearances could be deceiving. Eli kept aiming the tiny pistol. They were in a standoff. Con was in the middle, weaponless. The bare-chested man stood before them, holding a golf club with both hands, the way a baseball player would hold a bat. He looked ready and willing to club Con. His arm muscles twitched with readiness. Eli steadied his stance, took careful aim, and in his best Samuel L. Jackson voice, Eli said, "Drop the golf club! Now, you ghostly mother!" Con turned at the waist and punched Eli right between the eyes. Eli dropped the ray gun. It clattered to the wood floor. Eli's knees hit the floor next. He'd never been punched between the eyes before. Other parts of the face, sure, but this was a new world of stars and pain. He lifted his hands in the air and tried to look helpless, which wasn't much of a stretch, since he could barely see through his watering eyes, much less do anything heroic. The man with the golf club said, "I've got some cash in the cookie jar downstairs. Please, just take it. I won't tell anyone you are here, I swear." His voice trembled with fear, which seemed very unghost-like. "People, I don't want any trouble." "This is all a misunderstanding," Con said. "Have a look at my partner's forearm. Do you see something written on there?" He nudged Eli with the toe of his boot. "Hey, genius, show him your forearm, will you?" Eli blinked away some of the stars swimming around his head and turned his arm so the man with the golf club could read the address. The numbers had faded over the last day, but were still visible. That's my address, the man said, his voice still quaking. I don't understand. What do you want? You came here yesterday and ransacked my kitchen, and now you're back. Who are you? Terrorists?
We're gardeners, Con explained. I'm Leroy Fossbender, and this is my brother, Eli. I'm afraid Eli suffered a childhood illness that rendered him an idiot. He likes to point his toy gun at people. I apologize on his behalf. He can't do much, but he's an excellent gardener.
You're gardeners? The man seemed to be on the verge of a meltdown. Eli's eyes were working again, and he took a good look at the man's bare feet. The toes looked solid, and as real as any person's. I'm sorry, Eli murmured. Very sorry. I got confused. I thought you were a Con flicked him between the eyes with one finger.
Zip it. Bad, Eli. I gave you one thing to do. One simple thing. I told you to set up the exterior grow light with the hexapods, and you threw a rock through this nice man's window.
I did throw a rock, but Con flicked him again, which made Eli's eyes water. He zipped his lips. Con would deal with the situation the only way he could.
He thought he saw a scary ghost inside the house, Con said, chuckling. His favorite show is Scooby-Doo, and that's the whole story about how your front window got broken. Yesterday we got a call to come here to do some gardening, but now I realize my goober brother must have taken down the wrong address. Now I'm going to reach for my wallet so I can pay you for the broken window, and we'll be out of your hair.
You're really gardeners? Why are you dressed like commandos? Without hesitation, Con smoothly replied,
I'm glad you noticed our tight branding. Guerrilla gardening is the name of the operation. He reached over to ruffle Eli's hair with one hand. Guess who showed up in a big hairy gorilla costume the first day? Sweet, simple Eli. It's a good thing I like him so much.
Eli beamed with pride, because he couldn't help it. Con's fingers felt soothing in his hair, and that, plus the compliment, took away some of the sting from being punched and flicked between the eyes. From a nearby room, a child called out, Daddy?
Just a minute, sweetie,
the barefoot homeowner called out. To the guys, he said, Please, take the money and leave. I'm a single father, and I don't need any more trouble. This move has been a nightmare. This neighborhood is not what the real estate agent promised.
Con snorted. I don't know why people trust real estate agents. You wouldn't let a starving pack of hyenas do your grocery shopping now, would you?
The man's posture eased.
Sounds like you've been through a lot, Con said. I'm going to reach for my wallet now.
He slowly retrieved his wallet and counted out a handful of bills. It would be more than enough to cover the broken window. He offered the bills to the homeowner, who slowly set down the golf club and accepted the cash with a shaking hand. Eli got to his feet, keeping his head down and trying to look harmless. He did a visual search of the surrounding area for the ray gun, but it wasn't there. Con's hand swished near his cargo pants pocket, so he assumed Con must have grabbed it. The man said, So, you're really gardeners? What did you do to my seedlings? I've never seen anything grow like that.
Green thumb, Con said.
Leave me one of your cards. You have business cards, I assume? A nearby door opened and a child called out, Daddy?
Your son?
Con asked. Daughter. Homesick with the flu. She hasn't been herself since the move. She decided she doesn't like purple anymore, even though I bought this house partly because... He sighed. Kids, Con said in a way that implied he had several of his own. A child appeared at the doorway, her cheeks pink and feverish. She looked about 6 years old and didn't seem surprised to find two strangers in her father's home office. I'm thirsty, she said. These gentlemen are gardeners, her father explained. I'm just showing them out, and I'll get you some juice." "Can we go to Venny's?" she asked, sweetly. "Is that a friend of yours?" the father asked. Con said, "Actually, it's the dive bar, just a few blocks from here." He turned to the little girl and knelt down. "They don't clean the soap properly from their tapped beer lines. You can do a lot better than Vinny's." Eli noticed the father's eyes going to the golf club. "We need to go, boss," he said. Then he grabbed Con's arm and hauled him toward the stairs. From there, the two made a swift and apologetic retreat. They grabbed the bags of gear and walked out to the van without a word. Con took the passenger seat and put on his sunglasses. Eli checked his face in the rearview mirror. His eyelids were swelling, and he'd have 2 black eyes by nightfall. "Now what?" Eli asked. "I don't know. I'm not in a bowling mood anymore." "Did that little girl seem unusual to you?" "Yeah. She wasn't too annoying for a germ incubator." "Pretty cool kid." "Why would she ask to go to a bar, though?" Con shrugged. "She's a kid. She must have seen the neon sign and thought Vinny's was like some off-brand Chuck E. Cheese." "That makes sense." Eli prodded his swelling eyelids. "But now we're out 2 days of pay, plus the broken window. Come to think of it, we didn't get paid for the farmhouse job either." Con clapped his hands together suddenly. "That's it! I've got it all figured out." "What? What?" "Drive, Eli. U-turn. Go that way. There's no time to explain." Eli hit the gas. "Of course there's time. What's going on?" "No time. Just drive. Faster." Eli tapped the brakes. "How about I drive slower so there's time to explain?" "No, there's no time. Just drive." "I'm slowing down. I'm keeping it safely under the speed limit." "Now there's less time." Con snaked his leg over and stomped his boot on Eli's foot, pressing the accelerator. "Stop it! Tell me what we're doing." "There's no time to explain." They drove 5 more blocks, arguing the whole way over whether or not there really was time to explain. Eli finally parked the van under extreme protest, both of them still yelling over how and when whom should explain their actions. Con jumped out of the van and bolted toward a building. It was Vinny's, the neighborhood dive bar with the neon sign and the soapy draft lines. Eli realized he'd been had, but followed him in anyway. The dimly lit bar smelled like a basement. Eli looked around at all the day drinkers and felt shame on their behalf. It wasn't even lunchtime. He took a seat at the bar next to Con and ordered a club soda. Con swiveled his head and gave him a dirty look. "I'm not a day drinker," Eli explained. "We'll see about that." Con reached over and grasped Eli's nose between his thumb and forefinger. When Eli opened his mouth to protest, Con tossed a shot glass worth of tequila down his throat. Chapter 18. Eli Carter could no longer say he wasn't a day drinker. Eli Carter was a day drinker, and he liked it, because day drinking was awesome, and all the cool guys who hung out at Venny's were straight-up excellent dudes who had endless hilarious stories and very practical life advice. One of the regular day drinkers knew exactly what kind of girl Brenda was and offered several helpful tips for managing a woman like her. Most of the tips involved making her too exhausted from childcare to have any energy to dampen a man's creative energies. Eli was just drunk enough to think these were excellent ideas, but not drunk enough to tell Brenda about them over the phone when he called her to let her know he'd be late getting home. Dinner time came, and the men in the bar feasted like kings on barbecue chicken wings. Eli thought he was going to pass out, but around 10 o'clock he got a second wind. Con sobered up, and the tables turned. "It's getting late," Con said, between yawns. "You started this," Eli said. "You can go home if you want." He turned to the table of guys. "Hey, fellas, what do we do if our friends go home early?" In unison, the old men joyfully sang out, "Stay and make new friends." "You enjoy one more drink," Con said. "I'm stepping outside for some fresh air. Don't get into too much trouble without me." Eli raised his beer. "Okay, boss." The guys at the table laughed. Everyone thought it was funny when Eli called Con boss. The standard for humor set by the day drinkers was not very high. Another pitcher of beer arrived at the table, and one of the guys said, "Let's dedicate this round to that miserable old coot." The group got quiet, then murmured, "To Charlie." Glasses were refilled and raised in toast. Over the clinking, one of the guys said, "You chuckleheads." Then everyone was saying chuckleheads and laughing. Eli rubbed the scar on his scalp. He was getting an idea. It was still foggy, but he could taste the idea. "Who's Charlie?" he asked. The oldest and baldest of the men, the one who'd barely spoken all night, said, "He lived up the street at that orange house." "Not orange," said another guy. The bald man said, "That's right. Charlie would be rolling in his grave right now if he knew about how those house flippers painted his house purple." Another guy cut in. "Good old Charlie. Loved his Halloween decorations, and he loved his trains. Loved them more than people. But he was okay." Everyone nodded and murmured that Charlie had been okay. "To Charlie," they said, and clinked glasses again, all looking in the same direction. Eli followed their eyes to a shelf high on the wall, holding part of a model train, the locomotive. It was the same scale as the caboose he'd seen on the mantel back at the Purple House. The caboose had given him a feeling of familiarity that the toys in the toy box had not. However, it had been cleared of poltergeists. He held the caboose a couple of times, and Con had scanned it as well. Eli got up from the chair and staggered over to the shelf. Operating on a hunch, he reached for the locomotive. He was stopped by the bartender grabbing his arm. "That's not a toy," the burly man said. "But the locomotive doesn't belong to the bar. It belongs to a ghost, and he's inside there right now, I think. I need to touch it. My fingers will let me know." The bartender gave him a stern look. "Day drinking is not for everyone, son." "I just want to touch the locomotive." "I'm sure you do. I think you should be on your way now, son." "I'll go outside." The bartender grabbed him by the arm. "I'll show you the way." Eli had never been tossed out of a bar before. The bartender put some muscle into it and gave him a memorable toss. Eli had to run to keep up with the top of his body. 10 yards outside the door, he windmilled his arms to steady himself and come to a standstill. He let out a giddy laugh. He found Con sitting on the hood of an old car, leaning against the windshield and gazing up at the sky. "I got tossed out," Eli said. "It was awesome." Con kept looking up at the stars. "I shouldn't have dragged you into any of this. I'll have to let you go. We'll come up with a severance package. It might take a few weeks, but I'm good for it." "Don't be sad, Mr. Boss Man." Eli's feet tried to trip him multiple times, but he managed to get over to Con. "Hey, Mr. Boss Man, I figured out a whole bunch of stuff." Con patted the hood next to him. "Sit and be quiet. I'm trying to think." Eli attempted to climb onto the hood of the car, but kept sliding off. He suspected the car was haunted. Maybe everything was haunted. Con kept talking, almost to himself. "The thing about poltergeists is they don't like babies or small children." "How come?"
Well, poltergeists start out as regular ghosts, the spirits of people with unfinished business. But over time, they go mad, and they pick up other para-electrical bits and pieces, or they shatter apart and get put back together wrong. They go backwards, reverting to childlike behavior. Eli's moist palms squealed against the metallic surface as he slid back down the hood. They don't like babies because they want to be the baby. More or less. He kept looking up at the stars. Last night, when I thought you snuck up behind me to say those things, I should have known it wasn't you. I don't know why I always think the worst of people. It's because you lie to everyone, so you think everyone else will do the same to you. Khan whipped his head to look directly at Eli. Even in the darkness outside the bar, lit only by the neon sign above Vinny's, Eli could see the surprise in Khan's eyes. If I lie to everyone, why do you trust me? Eli took a run at the car hood and finally got up on it. He turned around to rest his back on the angled window so he could also look up at the stars. I asked you a question, Khan said. Why do you trust me? I punched you in the face today, and I threw tequila down your throat. I haven't apologized for either. Eli chuckled. I've never been punched between the eyes. He blinked up at the stars, which were very blurry tonight. I trust you because everybody's got to trust someone. That's not true. Of course it is. If I can say it, it's true. You're a weird guy, Eli Carter. I am a weird guy. Hey, Khan, want to see my impression of a necromancer? That's someone who could summon the dead, right? Like, really summon them. Khan sat up, propping himself up with one elbow so he could look directly at Eli. Don't tell me you're possessed again. I'll have to give you another decontamination shower. I'm not possessed, but I have a feeling about my phone. Eli pulled his phone from his pocket. Ordinarily, he wouldn't have so much confidence in a hunch, but he'd had a lot to drink. He was pretty sure he could get the phone to ring. He was also pretty sure he could fight the bartender, who outweighed him by 30 pounds of muscle. But he'd start with the phone thing. Eli cupped his hand around his mouth and yelled up at the starry night sky. Charlie! Hey, Charlie! If you want us to finish the extermination job, you have to phone me. Right now. You hear me, Charlie? Phone me! Off in the distance, a dog started barking at the noise. Within seconds, all the dogs in the neighborhood were barking. It was the kind of neighborhood where every sixth house had a big dog of some kind. Eli held his phone at arm's length, waiting. All at once, the dogs went quiet. The phone, which had been dead since that morning, began to ring. Eli turned to Khan and said, That's our client, the ghost who doesn't know he's dead. Khan frowned. Our client is a ghost. I knew that. I figured it out ages ago. No, I don't think you did. I totally knew. You said this was a simple poltergeist job. Well, obviously I didn't know then, not at the start. I still knew he was a ghost before you did. Khan leaned back again. Okay, you win. Now answer the phone and tell Charlie he's dead, and his 2 poltergeists are a single father and a kid. With pleasure. Eli touched the screen to accept the call. Hello, Charlie, he said with a friendly air. Chapter 19. The voice on the phone demanded, Who is this? Eli Carter. I'm one of the guys you hired to take care of your alleged poltergeists. Right. Well, I'm firing you 2 chuckleheads, and I'm not paying you a cent. The ghost client sounded angry.
his metal-tinged voice rolling around like water in a storm drain. Eli looked over to Con for some guidance. Con rubbed his thumb and forefinger together in the universal symbol for getting paid.
"Sir, would you mind meeting us? It won't take long, but there's something I'd like to talk to you about in person. We're down at Vinny's right now."
"Vinny's?" The voice softened.
I don't know if I'm welcome there." "Of course you are. Why don't you come on down? I'll buy you a drink." No. I promised myself I wouldn't go back. Not after the last few times. They all ignored me. You believe it? I've known some of those guys for 40 years, and they looked right through me like I wasn't even there."
Eli got so excited he could barely contain himself. It was going to make so much sense to Charlie once he found out he was actually a ghost. Everything would click together and stretch out before him, a puzzle solved.
"Come for a drink,"
Eli cajoled.
"No!"
The voice came with such power, Eli nearly dropped the phone. His ear was ringing, but he could just barely hear Charlie saying something about unfinished business.
"What's unfinished business?"
The voice cackled maliciously.
"Soon the house will be quiet, and I'll be able to find my locomotive and send it for its inaugural ride on the new set. It's a good thing those jerks at Vinny's are so rude, because I've had all this time to finish the model. The terrain work is the best I've ever done."
Eli held his hand over the mouthpiece and quietly asked Con,
"Can ghosts really move stuff, like a model train set?"
"Sure. He's a new ghost, so he can't do much, but—" Con trailed off, then his eyebrows shot up, along with his hand. "The attic. There was a model train set up there. It was huge, too big to take out without breaking it apart. That's it. The ghost has been hanging around doing his favorite hobby." Eli nodded.
"And his friends have the locomotive on a shelf inside the bar. They have no idea what they've done."
More cackling came from the phone, sounding more evil by the second.
"Charlie, what's going on over there? Where are you exactly?" "Never mind."
More creepy laughter.
"Say, you were here. Did you happen to see a locomotive? I found my caboose already, but I really need my locomotive. You didn't swipe it on me, did you?" "Of course not. But I know where it is. Should I bring it over to the house? We can have a talk, just the three of us. I have some very interesting information about your alleged poltergeists." "Why do you keep saying alleged? I'm looking at one of them right now. Disgusting creature. Slime coming out of everywhere."
He cackled some more, like he was planning something.
"Charlie, that's a little girl. Don't do anything crazy. We're coming right over with your locomotive."
Eli turned to Con for confirmation of their plans, but found he was alone on the hood of the car. The phone in his hand went quiet. Eli slowly slid off the hood of the car. His feet touched the ground just as the door of Vinny's bar clattered open. Con came running out, the locomotive in his hand.
"Start the van! There's no time to explain!"
Eli could barely stand, much less start the van. He tossed the keys to Con. The door of the bar cracked shut and then clattered open again. All Eli's new day-drinking buddies poured out, rightfully angry about a stranger taking the prized memento of their friend. The van was already moving. Eli had to run alongside it and try to jump in, like he was Indiana Jones. The passenger's side door wouldn't open, but luckily the window had been broken that morning. Eli dove into his van through the open window, arms first. His shoulder hit the bottom of the seat and stopped his inward trajectory. His legs and feet hung out of the window. He tried to roll and get himself all the way in, but the pocket of his new cargo pants caught on the door lock switch, and the heavy-duty fabric wouldn't rip.
"A little help would be nice,"
Eli said to Con.
"Stop goofing around. You're on the clock."
"I am? Is this overtime?" Con just kept driving. As they reached the house, he clicked off the lights, killed the engine, and coasted to a stop. Eli grabbed the seat with his hands, pushed himself away, and jumped back out the way he'd come in. Upright again, he felt great for 10 seconds. Then he suddenly vomited into the nearby hedges. Con patted him on the back. "It's for the best, my man. You shouldn't drink on the job. It's unprofessional." Eli heaved 3 more times until he was empty. He wiped his mouth and, with grim determination, said, "Time to take care of that train-loving ghost. Let's go play choo-choo." Con stood with his hands on his hips, looking up at the dark house. All the lights were out, the residents gone to bed. Eli thought of the jumpy homeowner with his golf club. They weren't going to buzz the doorbell and try to explain the situation to anyone, not unless they wanted to get beaten or arrested. Con gestured for Eli to follow him to the back of the house. "These old houses usually have external fire escapes. If I stand on your shoulders, I might be able to get up and let us into the attic." Eli walked in the opposite direction, over to the living room window he'd broken earlier that day. He pulled at the plastic taped down to the corner, then made a bird whistle sound to call Con over. Con frowned at the plastic. "They should have put wood up if the window guys couldn't get it fixed today. This isn't safe." "I know. They're liable to get all sorts of weirdos in here. Hey, watch this." Eli backed up, took a running leap, and dove through the plastic barrier, just like Indiana Jones. This time, he nailed the landing, rolling to a stop on the living room floor. Con climbed in carefully. "No more all-day drinking for you," he whispered. Eli got to his feet and fought his way out of the plastic wrap. Con stopped to look at what remained of the seedlings they'd hyper-grown in the window. "I feel like I'm forgetting something," he said. "You got the locomotive?" Con held it aloft, nodded, then turned to move toward the stairs. Eli followed him up as quietly as he could in his inebriated state. They reached the second floor, where the residents were presumably sleeping. Both bedroom doors were closed. When they walked past the little girl's room, Eli got a chill up his spine. He wrote it off as the nervousness any normal person ought to feel over breaking into someone's house for the 3rd time in 2 days. They opened the door to the narrow stairs leading up the attic, and Con led the way. It was dark in the attic, and they both fumbled around looking for a light switch. Con found something and flicked it on. Electricity flowed into hundreds of tiny lights scattered throughout the miniature village that lay before them. The landscape model was an enormous 10 feet wide on the shorter side and took up half of the attic. It had been built on a network of tables, so it stood at hip height for easy access. Both Eli and Con circled the model with silent reverence. "Look at the detail on those red barns," Con said. "I've never seen anything like it, except for at museums." Eli leaned over a covered bridge. "You know, I may be way off here, but is this a replica of the model from that movie Beetlejuice?" He gasped. "Look at the little truck. That's Beetlejuice in a truck with floozies." "Floozies?" Con leaned over with interest. "Huh. I haven't seen that movie in ages. Was it a train model or just a replica of the village?" "I can't remember, but I own a copy of the movie. You should come over sometime and we can watch it. We can call it research because of the ghost stuff." Con chuckled. "Research." Eli spotted a little purple house with green trim. He leaned over to take a closer look. One corner of the house had been painted orange, and a tiny man in an orange shirt leaned over the bucket of paint. Eli blinked hard. Was the tiny man moving, or was it just his imagination? Could it be? He leaned over the model and whispered, "Charlie." The attic was so quiet, like the whole house was holding its breath. Someone's screaming pierced the stillness. Eli and Con jolted upright. The scream came again. It was a child. Eli started for the stairs, but Con caught him with one arm. "Think it through," Con growled.
Remember the golf club." They held still, listening as the homeowner opened his bedroom door and raced to the child's room. The handle rattled, and then the man banged on the door. "Sweetie, open the door right now! Stop playing around!" She continued screaming, yelling about the orange monster. Her frightened cries made Eli's blood run cold. He couldn't make out her words, but she was screaming about the orange monster in her room, who was sucking out all of the air. "We have to save her," Eli said. "Think it through," Khan said slowly. "A ghost's power is the fear it generates. Listen to your heart. Let the fear energize your mind." From the floor below came the thumping sounds of the father trying to shoulder his way through a stuck door. Eli turned back to face the miniature townscape. He let the tingling in his nerves pulse through his body and up into his head. His sinuses began to sting as though filled with salt water. "Charlie," Eli commanded, "are you going to get up here and show us this new model or what?" Eli reached down into the model landscape with one hand. Like a giant, he easily plucked a tree from a rolling hill. "Charlie, if you keep us waiting, I'll be forced to rearrange some of this stuff. I'm a fidgety guy, and I like playing with other people's things. I'm clumsy, too." Khan joined in. "Charlie, my man, you call that a tree? Looks like a piece of broccoli. I see everything now. This piece of amateur crap is why you haven't been with the gang down at Vinny's. You've been up here gluing broccoli to a sheet of plywood covered in green velvet." "Not velvet," came a new voice. "That's flocking." Khan turned his head left and right, a grin on his face. "It's flocking tacky is what it is." The disembodied voice replied, "I'll show you tacky." Khan chuckled. "You're not showing us anything. Why don't you just show yourself?" The lights in the miniature city flickered. From the floor below them came the sound of a door opening, then the happy cries of a relieved father comforting his child. Eli felt the tension in his face ease up. Things were going much better now. He let his attention drift back down to the train set. Now that he was having a second look, he could see the fault lines where the segments of carved foam had been joined. The air in the room crackled with energy. Eli looked up as a foggy orange form coalesced on the other side of the miniature village. At the center of the fog was a glinting object. Khan backed away from the misty form and came around to stand at Eli's side. There was an unusual expression on Khan's face. Fear. "Charlie, where'd you get that?" Khan demanded. The foggy shape looked more like a man now, a gray-haired man wearing a bright orange shirt, the garment Eli had first mistaken for a prisoner's uniform. The glinting object at the center moved forward, held now by ghostly fingers. It was a tiny pistol. The ray gun number 112 that Eli had taken from Khan and then dropped earlier that day. "I found this under the bed," Charlie said in his ghostly metallic voice. "I thought it was just a toy, but it's not a toy, is it?" With a shaking hand, he aimed the ray gun at Eli, then Khan, then back again. "You're right, Charlie. That's not a toy," Khan said. "It's a powerful growth accelerant. If you shoot me with it, I'll grow big and huge, and then I'll have to smash your village before you've tested it with your locomotive." He held up the train, teasingly. "Why don't we trade?" The last bits of fog slipped into place, and Charlie became solid-looking. He glanced around the attic, seemingly confused. "Where are my boxes of Halloween decorations?" Eli kept his attention on the ray gun. He had no way of knowing what it would do to a person. He couldn't know that a concentrated blast would stop a human's heart, or that the danger it posed to humans was the main reason model number 112 never went into production. But he did know power. Eli was certain the gun had power, and equally certain he didn't want a face full of whatever it blasted. "Come on, let's trade," Khan said nonchalantly. He was still holding out the locomotive. "I don't trust you," the ghost said. "You never stop lying." Khan shrugged. Fine, shoot me. I'll throw your precious locomotive on the ground and stomp it to pieces."
Charlie's glowing hand became steady, and he aimed the gun at Con. His glowing finger twitched and pulled the trigger. The room flashed with dazzling light. Eli turned to Con. Eli's vision became superpowered, as it had during the demonstration on the seedlings. This time, he didn't see through the couch cushions to count loose change. He saw Con's ribs, and then he saw his heart. It beat faster and faster, and Eli saw it in 3 dimensions, the blood whooshing through. There was something different about Con's heart that wasn't like the illustrations he'd seen in science classes. He didn't have long to ponder the anomaly, because Con's heart went still. All the color went out of the world. Con's body clenched, and then let go. Eli reached for his friend. He didn't move fast enough to catch him, but he did slow Con's fall to the floor. The attic hummed with a bad vibration. Eli's vision was on its way back to normal, but still had some depth. He could see that Con's heart was motionless, not beating. A part of Eli pulled away from the scene and denied that this was happening. He was just sleeping off the alcohol. This was a nightmare. He'd wake up in a minute. Charlie approached the 2 of them, then leaned over and reached his glowing arm down. He took the locomotive from Con's limp hand.
"There it is," Charlie said happily. "I've been looking all over for my engine."
He carried the locomotive over to the edge of the village, where a train station waited. Charlie began to whistle as he hooked together the train pieces. Eli shook Con and urged him to wake up. Con didn't respond.
"Charlie, we've got to get help,"
Eli said.
"Help! Up here!"
he yelled. The door at the bottom of the attic stairs slammed shut.
"Not yet," Charlie said. 5 more minutes. I'm almost done. Don't you want to see the train go through the village?" "My friend needs help."
Eli could hear the homeowner trying to get the door to the attic open. Even if he was going to come up with a golf club, it would be better than nothing.
"Charlie, open that door. Open it right now." "And let those poltergeists up here? No way. The little one takes my houses apart faster than I can put them together."
Eli looked wildly around the attic. He spotted the ray gun, lying unattended on the green flocked hills. He rose to standing, grabbed the gun, aimed it at the ghost, and pulled the trigger. Chapter 20. After Eli squeezed the trigger, the attic flashed with dazzling light again. Eli saw through Charlie, through the eaves of the old house and past multiple layers of roofing tiles, to the stars and the moon. He saw the moon's craggy terrain in high definition and the equipment left behind by astronauts. Eli gritted his teeth, focused hard, and pulled his attention back into the attic, to Charlie. The ghost seemed unaffected by the ray gun blast. He brushed dust off his orange shirt and said,
"It'll take more than that to put down a tough old bugger like me."
Eli dropped the gun, defeated. He turned to Con, pale and lifeless on the ground. Eli's anger flared up and raged inside him. Ghosts! He'd had enough of them. They were nothing but trouble, and now one had killed his friend. They were... He found a spot of calm inside his rage. Ghosts were sometimes like Donnie, who had possessed him and left behind those memories. All those memories. Donnie, who'd found his girlfriend cold and lifeless. Donnie, who'd given her CPR until the police had arrived. Eli knelt down next to Con and focused on his friend's words. "A ghost's power is the fear it generates. Listen to your heart. Let the fear energize your mind." The training that Donnie had taken during the summer he'd worked as a lifeguard now became Eli's training. His body didn't know the movements, and then it did. He breathed air into Con's lungs and applied the chest compressions to keep blood circulating. Nothing happened. He used his shoulder to wipe the sweat from his brow, and he kept going. "Come back," he urged between breaths. "You can't leave me like this." "Why?" Eli looked around him. It hadn't been Charlie speaking. because he was playing with his train set, oblivious to his surroundings. Eli continued compressions, staring at Khan's blank eyes. "You just can't go yet," Eli said. "I don't like it when people go away. Come back."
"Why?"
"Because I barely know you, and you're my best friend." Eli wiped his wet face on his shoulder again. "And because this isn't how you go. Not like this, not in someone's attic without a fight. You're a hero, and you don't go like this." He leaned down and blew more air into Khan's lungs. When he pulled back, Khan's eyes tracked him. A dozen feet away, Charlie the ghost hooted happily as the model train whizzed around the track on its inaugural run. Eli pressed down on Khan's chest and found resistance. Khan's body convulsed and shook as he shuddered back to life. Eli sat back on his heels, even more doubtful that any of this was happening. Khan rolled onto his side, facing away from Eli, and groaned.
"I'm going to be sick."
"Whoa, is that a side effect of the ray gun?"
"No, it's a side effect of you kissing me with your vomit mouth."
Eli got indignant. "I wasn't kissing you. I care about you, but not like that. You should be nicer to me, because I just saved your life." Khan rolled onto his back, moaning and rubbing his mouth.
"Yuck. What did you throw up, possum?"
Eli took a test breath on his palm. The smell was not good. Maybe he had consumed possum. Khan pushed himself up to his sitting position. He leaned over and whispered,
"Did you know you have a tiny metal disc in your head?"
"Did you see that when you were dead?"
Khan snorted. "I wasn't dead. Trust me, I've been dead before, and I know dead. That was not dead."
He snorted again.
"No, I saw it when the ray gun went off. It's right there in your frontal lobe, almost like some sort of microchip."
He rubbed his chest and made a pained expression.
"Are you part android?"
"Not that I know of." The train kept whizzing around the nearby track, faster and faster. Khan frowned in Charlie's direction.
"Well, I'm not paying you overtime for you to sit around. Get rid of that ghost, will you?"
Eli got to his feet and smoothed down his clothes, trying to look professional. "Charlie, we need to talk." The ghost was dabbing glue on the base of the tree Eli had uprooted.
"No thanks."
"Listen, I'm a professional ghost hacker. It's my job to go in and deal with people's ghosts. So, I am uniquely qualified to inform you that your lovely home does not contain any poltergeists." Charlie leaned over the terrain and pressed the tree back into place.
"You're a chucklehead."
"Sir, I regret to inform you that you are deceased. This house is purple because a real estate flipper bought it and painted it that color before selling it to a single father and his daughter. They're the ones who seem like poltergeists to you. I know this is a lot to take in, but it's actually you who's haunting this house." Charlie pulled the tree back up and applied more glue. He whistled as he glued it back down again. Eli continued. "That's why the guys at the bar ignored you, Charlie. They couldn't see you."
"Those guys never liked me."
Charlie's glowing form looked less stable now, with spots ebbing away like steam.
"They're a bunch of jerks."
"Don't say that. I was down there all day. They might be jerks, but they're the kind of jerks a person would be happy to have as friends. I had a great time with them." Khan got to his feet, holding onto the edge of the table for stability.
"The guys would want you to move on and be happy," Khan said. "They really loved you."
Charlie frowned.
"They said that? You're a liar."
Khan started to answer, but Eli held his hand up as if to say, "I've got this one." Eli looked into Charlie's ghostly eyes. "You're right. They didn't say they loved you, but they did a toast for you, and they said you were okay. Not that you are, but that you were an okay guy. Because you're dead now."
They Said I was okay?"
Charlie patted his chest and arms, a look of surprise on his face.
"Holy smokes! I'm a ghost. The sexy mail carrier didn't say hello because she couldn't see me."
Eli nodded. "That's right." Charlie's face brightened.
"I'm a ghost. I can drink as much beer as I want and never get a hangover. I can follow that sexy mail carrier home and watch her get undressed."
"That's awful," Eli said.
"It's my afterlife. Get your own afterlife, sonny."
Con interrupted.
"Don't you want to move on from here, on to new challenges? You've finished your masterpiece, and now you're done. Go cross over. You don't want to stay here for long, or eventually you won't be yourself anymore."
"Not myself?"
Charlie asked. "But I like being me." "Is this who you are? A mean old man who hides in his attic? A nasty old coot with no friends?"
Eli elbowed Con and whispered,
"You don't have to be so mean." "I'm not an old man."
Charlie shifted before their eyes, but not into fog. He got smaller and smaller until he was a young boy of about 10. Now his eyes were the same height as the peaks of the hills on the terrain before him. Eli heard the humming in the room change tone to something more soothing. He smiled at the little boy standing across the miniature village from him.
"Hi, Charlie. My name is Eli," he said. "Thank you for showing me your train. I can tell you worked really hard to put everything together."
Charlie looked up at Eli with big eyes and asked, "Are there model trains on the other side?" Eli wanted to say yes to the little boy, but he couldn't. Young Charlie turned to Con. "Well?" Con answered,
"Yes, of course there are model trains on the other side, and everything else you've always wanted. Plus everyone who's ever loved you, and they're all waiting. You don't want to keep them waiting, do you?"
The little boy began to glow, brighter and brighter, every color at once. He reached for the locomotive and held it to his chest. "I'm taking this with me." Eli opened his mouth to say that Charlie probably couldn't take the locomotive with him, since people were often pointing out all the things that couldn't be taken into the afterlife, and therefore it had to be true. But then Charlie blinked out of existence in the attic, along with the locomotive. Eli turned to Con, who was now leaning heavily on the table and rubbing his chest. Con said,
"What do you know? You can take it with you."
I found that part very surprising. The table groaned under Con's leaning weight.
"We should get out of here," Eli said. "Did we finish eating all those pickled eggs?"
Con turned and sat up on the terrain, crunching trees under his butt.
"We're not raiding this poor family's kitchen. They've been through enough."
The door at the bottom of the attic stairs unlocked and creaked open. An angry voice called up from below.
"Hello? Is someone up there? I've got a 9-iron and I'm coming up swinging."
Con and Eli took one look at each other, then ran for the window at the end of the attic. Getting out was a tight fit, mainly because they both tried to climb out the window together instead of going one at a time, but they did exit the house just fast enough to avoid being beaten with a golf club. They scrambled down the fire escape, ran around to the van, and peeled away down the street. Con was driving, and he took the van around a left turn on 2 wheels, squealing with joy. Eli fastened his seatbelt and joked,
"Where'd you learn to drive?" "Right here, in this driver's seat."
He rolled down the window and howled at the moon. When he pulled his head back in, he said,
"I've never touched a gas pedal until the day you let me drive this beauty."
Waves of realization washed over Eli. No wonder Con was so terrifying behind the wheel. If Eli had been able to see his own face, he might have noted how fascinating it was, the similarities between his own face now and Charlie's face when he'd discovered he was a ghost. Eli turned and looked behind them, out of the rear window of the van. He couldn't see the house anymore because they were blocks away, but the movement still helped him put some perspective on the day.
We actually got rid of another ghost, Eli said with wonder. Is it always like that? Did you have fun? Except for the part where you died, I had fun. Then, yes, it's often like that, though I do generally try to get paid. Good point. I'm sure it works better when the human is the client and not the ghost. Better luck tomorrow. Eli yawned. It was late, and he couldn't imagine getting out of bed the next morning, much less hunting down more ghosts. Sleepily, he asked, "What's the job tomorrow?" It's another easy one. Total home run. Open and shut. Easy peasy. Mm-hmm. Eli slumped down in the passenger seat, closed his eyes, and instantly fell asleep. Falling asleep anywhere was one of Eli's talents. Con drove for a while, then asked Eli a few questions to make sure he was asleep. When he was sure he had privacy, Con turned up the radio and sang along with a rock ballad. When the song ended, he pulled out his phone and called his sister. "Val, do you have anything you can hack up and use to scan someone's head? Like a microwave you can turn into an X-ray, or one of those whatchamacallits? An MRI?"
Author's Note for The Ghost Who Wasn't There. This is Angela Pepper, back with another author's note. My favorite part of The Ghost Who Wasn't There was the whole bit about, "Get in the van now, there's no time to explain." It's just the sort of thing that I find funny. As you may have guessed, I had a lot of fun writing The Ghost Who Wasn't There. At the time I was working on it, I did worry that the story was kind of getting away on me, that it was getting too surreal and in-jokey. I became insecure about how it was going to turn out, and so I did something I don't normally do, which is I got my husband, who's my first reader, to read it while I was writing it, chapter by chapter. Something interesting happened when he started reading my day's work at the end of the day. Rather than helping me keep the book on the rails, the book just became even more surreal and in-jokey, which is great. It wasn't super clear to me at the time, but now that I have the perspective of looking back, I can see that it was exactly the right thing to do. For example, the character of Con is inspired by a friend of ours, Jeff. Not the whole personality, but definitely the hair and a little bit of the attitude. The character of Eli Carter is loosely based on my husband, who was a delivery driver when we first met. He also shares many of Eli's traits, including some of the ADD behavior. Another funny thing about my husband, besides the fact that he's basically Eli Carter, is that whenever I tell him about something that I have planned for my books, he hates it. He hates hearing it from me, but when I write it all out and I put it on the page, he loves it. I don't know what that's all about, but I figured you might find it interesting to hear about how the proverbial sausage gets made. It's because of his allergies to hearing about my ideas before they're written that I don't give away a lot of clues to my readers about what I have planned for the series. I have to assume that many people would feel the same way he does, which is that when they just hear about the idea in summary without all the details, it doesn't sound as good as it actually is when it's fully written. Well, that's the main reason I don't give spoilers on my series. The second reason is that I don't entirely know what's going to happen. All of my plans are subject to change. Even though I don't have human actors coming in and playing the roles of my characters, at least not until the audiobooks are getting recorded, these characters still come to life, in a way. Even though I'm the only person writing them, the characters have a certain chemistry with each other. Some authors report that their characters live inside of their heads even when they're not writing, chattering away all the time. That is not something that I experience. My own mind is actually pretty quiet. I don't hear voices in there. I don't even really see a lot of pictures in there. It's a quiet, peaceful place. I can't complain. Perhaps that's why I've never seen the point in meditating. I don't need to. The only time I see or hear my characters is when I am actively writing their stories. That means that I'm not actually keeping any stories from you. The stories simply don't exist until I write them. I realize that many other authors will say the exact opposite thing, that they're full of stories just waiting to be written. And for those people, I'm sure that's completely true. It's just not how it is for me. I'm not telling you about how my brain works to try to convince you that I'm better or worse than any other author, or that my creative struggles are more or less intriguing. I'm just telling you because you are a reader, and readers are generally interested in how other people think and feel and experience the world, whether those people are imaginary or not. On that note, let's move on to our next Ghost Hackers adventure. This is Angela Pepper, and I think my brain is pretty normal, though it's never been scanned, so I may have a microchip in there. We'll never know.
This has been a production of The Ghost Who Wasn't There, a paranormal cozy mystery. Eli Carter and the Ghost Hackers, Paranormal Mysteries, Book 2. Written by Angela Pepper. Read for you by John Perhala. Copyright 2014 by Angela Pepper. Production copyright 2017 by Angela Pepper.